Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Chapter 1, The Ice Purgatory. The Mi-8 helicopter, engines roaring like a wounded beast, reluctantly clawed its way up from the frozen earth of Kangerlussuaq. Dr. Eris Thorne gripped the seat strap, feeling the vibration hum through the thin cushion and deep into his bones. Outside the porthole, a bleak landscape rushed past, gray-brown cliffs dusted with snow like powdered sugar, and sparse, stunted clumps of Arctic willow clinging to life in the permafrost. Purgatory, Eris thought, a wry smile touching his thin lips. That's precisely how he'd felt for the past 2 years of his life, ever since the Polaris event. A grand name for a mundane error in satellite data interpretation, inflated to cosmic proportions by sensation-hungry journalists and gloating colleagues. His university professorship, grants, respect, all turned to ash. All that remained was this desperate expedition to station Hyperion in the deepest wilds of Greenland, his last chance, if not to reclaim his good name, then at least to prove to himself that he was still worth something. Station Hyperion. Even the name felt like a taunt. A titan, overthrown by the Olympians. Eris could almost physically feel the weight of the work ahead, the icy breath of isolation, and the crushing anticipation, not of failure, no, he'd already experienced that, but of confirming his calculations. The anomalous thawing of the Niflheim's Tooth Glacier was so out of the ordinary that most of his former colleagues had simply dismissed it as another of Thorne's fantasies. But the data he'd gathered remotely was irrefutable. Something strange was happening out there, at the edge of the world, and Eris was the only one dared to check it personally. Pathological rationality, his therapist, whom Eris's ex-wife had practically forced him to see after the scandal, had called it. An unwillingness to believe in the unscientific. Eris had merely shrugged at the time. What else was there to believe in, if not numbers, facts, and logic? The world was a complex, but knowable, mechanism. And he, Eris Thorne, was one of those who tried to understand its gears. The helicopter banked, preparing for landing. Below, amidst the endless white desert, the structures of Hyperion appeared, several modules connected by walkways, resembling scattered children's blocks. Nearby, a landing strip, cleared of snow, gleamed dully. No romance of polar exploration here. Only functionality and cold. So much cold. The landing was hard. Eris unbuckled his belt and, rubbing his stiff muscles, prepared to step out to meet his personal hell or, if he was lucky, his triumph. The door slid open, and an icy wind burst into the cabin, smelling of snow and something else, a faint, strange, almost metallic tang that Eris hadn't noticed in the Arctic before. Only one person was there to meet him, a bearded man in a thick polar suit, Jens, the station chief and, concurrently, mechanic, cook, and Eris's sole human companion for the coming months. His face, chapped and red, was inscrutable. "Welcome to Hyperion, Dr. Thorne," his voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken much lately. "Hope you brought plenty of optimism. It runs out fast here." Eris just nodded. Optimism was the last thing on his mind. His thoughts were consumed by data, graphs, and the anomaly hidden beneath the ice of Niflheim's Tooth. He didn't yet know that this anomaly was far older, far more terrifying, and far closer than he could ever imagine. And that the ice beneath his feet wasn't just melting, it was beginning to awaken. Jens grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and gestured towards a tracked vehicle, its engine already rumbling softly in the biting air. "Cargo's mostly unloaded. Your sensitive equipment is in Lab 1. Main module's that way." Eris slung his personal bag over his shoulder, the weight of it a familiar discomfort. "Lab 1. Good." He followed Jens. The crunch of their boots on the compacted snow the only sound besides the wind and the vehicle's idling engine. The air was thin, sharp, and carried that unsettling metallic hint. He made a mental note to check the station's air filtration system, though he suspected it was an external atmospheric condition. Atmospheric trace elements released by the thaw. Possible. His mind immediately sought a rational explanation. Station Hyperion was utilitarian to the extreme. Prefabricated modules, painted a faded orange that did little to cheer the monochrome landscape, were connected by enclosed, clattering metal walkways. Small, triple-glazed windows offered glimpses of interiors that looked Spartan and functional. It was a place stripped bare of anything but necessity, a hermetically sealed outpost against an indifferent, lethal environment. Lab 1 was surprisingly well-equipped, a relic of a more optimistic, better-funded era of polar research. Banks of monitors, specialized sensor arrays, and connection ports lined the walls. Much of it was older tech, but Eris had brought his own cutting-edge sensors, currently packed in heavily padded crates. Power grid stable, mostly, Jens said, leaning against a workbench littered with tools and schematics. Old girl, but she holds. We run checks twice daily. Comms are satellite, bit temperamental with solar flares, but you'll get your data out. Excellent, Eris said, already mentally cataloging the setup, his fingers itching to unpack his instruments. This was his domain, his sanctuary. Here, amidst the hum of machinery and the glow of data streams, he felt a semblance of control. The glacier monitoring arrays, are they still transmitting? Jens nodded towards a large screen displaying a complex topological map of Nibelheim's tooth, dotted with sensor markers. Most were green, a few amber. Active. Some are showing odd readings lately. That's your department, I guess. He didn't elaborate, his gaze distant. Eris moved closer to the screen, his earlier unease momentarily forgotten, replaced by the familiar thrill of impending discovery. The odd readings were precisely why he was here. He pointed to a cluster of amber icons near the glacier's terminus. This area here, the primary melt zone. The temperature gradients are unprecedented. Tell me about it, Jens muttered, scratching his beard. Feels like spring some days. Don't like it. Ice should be ice. He pushed himself off the workbench. Your bunk is in module beta, second door on the left. Galleys in alpha. Dinner's at 1900. Don't be late. I make a mean seal stew. He offered a ghost of a smile, then turned and left, leaving Eris alone with the humming machines and the silent, watching ice. For hours, Eris worked, meticulously unpacking and calibrating his equipment. He cross-referenced his remote sensing data with the station's live feeds, his brow furrowed in concentration. The anomaly was even more pronounced than he'd anticipated. The rate of basal melt beneath Nibelheim's tooth defied current climatological models. It wasn't just surface warming, something was happening deep within, or under, the ice. As dusk began to creep in, painting the sky outside the lab window in hues of bruised purple and blood orange, Eris paused. He stretched, his back aching. The lab was quiet, save for the soft whir of fans and the occasional click of a relay. Then he heard it, a faint, almost subaudible sound. A low, resonant hum, like distant, immense machinery, or perhaps, singing. He froze, listening intently. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only the normal sounds of the station. Wind through a ventilation shaft, he told himself firmly. Or the ice settling. Perfectly normal. But as he turned back to his monitors, the numbers and graphs suddenly seemed less absolute, less reassuring. The metallic tang in the air, Jens's laconic unease, the fleeting sound. His pathological rationality, his shield against the unscientific, felt the faintest, almost imperceptible tremor. He shook his head, annoyed at the flicker of fancy. He was tired. Isolated. Stressed. He needed data, hard data. That would dispel any lingering shadows. Wouldn't it? Chapter 2 OK echoes in the static. Dinner was a quiet affair. Jens, true to his word, served a surprisingly palatable, let's continue with Chapter 2, deepening the atmosphere and Eris seal stew, thick and savory, accompanied by hardtack biscuits. Conversation was sparse, limited to operational necessities, fuel's initial experiences. Underscore 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 underscore. Chapter 2, Whispers on the Edge of Silence. Dinner with Jens was a sparse affair, both in terms of food and conversation. The Vmeen seal stew was an acquired taste, gamey and oily consumption, weather forecasts, the erratic behavior of the shortwave radio. Eris found Jens to be a man of few words, his gaze often drifting to the small, reinforced window of the galley, as if searching for something in the encroaching polar night. But Eris ate dutifully, needing the calories. Jens, for his part, seemed content to eat in silence. "He's been seeing more auroras lately," Jens remarked, spooning another helping of stew onto Eris's plate without asking, gaze often drifting to the reinforced window of the galley, beyond which the Arctic night had now fully descended, an impenetrable wall. Brighter than usual. Messes with the calm something fierce. Increased solar activity could explain some of the of black. "Been quiet up here, mostly," Jens said abruptly, startling Eris as he pushed his bowl. "Atmospheric ionization," Eris mused, more to himself than to Jens. "Might even contribute marginally to localized surface warming, away. Before you, I mean." Last rotation was a geologist. Kept to himself. Before that, a pair, but not to the extent we're seeing at Niflheim's Tooth. The basal melt is the core issue. Of glaciologists. They argued a lot. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "This place does," Jens just grunted, a non-committal sound that Eris was beginning to recognize as his primary mode of communication. "Ice is doing what it wants. Always has." After the meal, Eris retreated to his cramped quarters. "Things to people. Isolation can be challenging," Eris offered, trying to sound detached, professional. Jens's eyes, pale blue and startlingly bright in his weathered face, seemed to look right through him. In Module Beta. It was a small, functional box, a narrow bunk, a small desk bolted to the wall, a tiny wash basin. He tried to review some of his research papers, but the words swam before his eyes. "The journey, it ain't just the isolation, document. It's the quiet. And the sounds when it ain't quiet." He paused, then seemed to regret saying anything more. "Get some rest. Big day tomorrow." The unpacking, the sheer weight of his self-imposed mission were taking their toll. He lay back on the bunk, the rhythmic hum of the station's life support a dull lullaby. Sleep, however, was elusive. "I reckon. You'll want to get out on the ice." Eris nodded, not pressing. He was mind kept replaying the anomalous data from Niflheim's Tooth, searching for patterns, for conventional explanations. And then here to psychoanalyze the station chief. He was here for Niflheim's Tooth. His bunk, there was that sound in the lab, that brief, resonant hum. He tried to dismiss it again, but it in Module Beta was small, a narrow cot, a tiny desk, and a locker. The only window was a small, reinforced porthole that looked out onto a snowdrift piled high against the module wall. It felt like being buried alive. He unpacked, lingered at the edge of his awareness, like a forgotten word on the tip of his tongue. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him. But his dreams were not restful. They were a chaotic swirl of fractured images, colossal ice caverns glowing with an internal light, his few personal belongings, a couple of changes of thermal wear, a thick volume on advanced glacial dynamics, and a framed photograph of his daughter, Lily, smiling gap-toothed from a school play. He stared at it for a long moment, a familiar, the grinning, frost-rimed faces of men he didn't know, and a sound, a deep, resonant ache in his chest. Proving himself here wasn't just about his career, it was, in some convoluted way, he thrumming that vibrated through his very bones, accompanied by faint, indecipherable whispers. He woke with a start, couldn't fully articulate, about being worthy of that smile again. Sleep, when it finally came, was restless, his heart pounding, the dream voices still echoing in his ears. The small digital clock on his desk glowed 3:17. The station was silent, save for the ever-present hum. Just a dream. He dreamt not of Lily, nor of the Polaris event, but of vast, empty spaces. Immense, geometric, he told himself, running a hand over his face. Isolation playing tricks. But the clarity of the whispers, the sense of structures of ice, glowing with a faint inner light, shifted and reformed in slow, ponderous rhythms. And through it all, an ancient, patient thought that had permeated the dream, left a residue of unease. The next few days fell into a routine. Sound, that same low, resonant hum he'd heard in the lab, but deeper now, more pervasive, like the breathing Eris spent most of his time in Lab 1, poring over data, running diagnostics on his newly deployed sensors, and of something colossal. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, the echo of the hum still thrumming in his venturing out onto the ice plain near Nibelheim's Tooth to take direct measurements. The glacier was a colossal, brooding years. The digital clock on his small bedside table read 3:17. The module was silent, save for the gentle presence, its face a sheer cliff of ancient, blue-streaked ice. The meltwater rivers at its base were more sigh of the ventilation system. Just a dream, he told himself, rubbing his temples. Stress-induced. Turbulent, their volume greater than historical record suggested for this time of year. During one of these excursions, as he was drilling the change in environment, but the vividness of it, the feeling of ancient, patient thought that had permeated the dream, for an ice core sample near a newly formed crevasse, his equipment began to act erratically. The ground-penetrating radar lingered uncomfortably. The next few days fell into a routine. Eris rose before dawn, spent hours in display flickered, showing ghost images, and his normally reliable GPS briefly lost its satellite lock, placing him several hundred meters from Lab 1 poring over data, then, if the weather permitted, ventured out with Jens in the tracked vehicle to check sensor arrays or deploy new ones closer to Nibelheim's Tooth. The glacier itself was a majestic, terrifying sight, his actual position. Damn solar flares, he muttered, tapping the GPS unit. He'd have to factor in potential magnetic interference. Yet, the anomalies seemed localized, more intense the closer he got to the glacier's tongue, a towering wall of serrated ice, blues and whites shifting in the low Arctic sun, groaning and cracking with internal pressures. It was also during these trips that he first noticed the silence. Not the absence of sound, the wind always the melt zone at its foot was a chaotic mess of slush, meltwater streams, and calving ice. The anomalous readings continued, even intensified. The temperature probes buried deep within the ice were registering warmth that had no geological or atmospheric explanation. Seismic whispered or roared, the ice groaned and cracked, but an oppressive quality to it, as if the very air sensors picked up peculiar, rhythmic tremors that weren't earthquakes. One afternoon, while retrieving a data logger, Nero was holding its breath. Sometimes, amidst the natural sounds, he would catch it again, that fleeting, low hum, seeming newly formed meltwater channel. Eris heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a hum. It was to emanate from the depths of the ice itself. Each time, it was gone before he could be certain. The clearer, more defined, like a multitude of voices, too faint to distinguish words, but undeniably there, seeming to emanate from voices from his dream did not return, but he found himself increasingly on edge, his sleep fragmented. He started the ice itself, or perhaps carried on the wind that whipped down from the glacier's face. He stopped, leaving a small audio recorder running in the lab at night, ostensibly to catch any equipment malfunctions. Secretly, he was up a gloved hand. Jens? Did you hear that? Jens, who was wrestling with a hoping to capture something else, though his rational mind recoiled from the thought. One evening, while trying to establish jammed winch on the vehicle, paused. Hear what? Wind's picking up. Sounds like it always does. No, not the wind. Voices. Singing, almost. Jens stared at him, his expression unreadable under a stable data link with a recalcitrant sensor buoy near the glacier's calving front. The shortwave radio in the lab crackled to life unexpectedly. It wasn't Jens trying to reach him from the main module, this was different. His goggles and balaclava. Voices? Out here. Doc, there's nothing for miles but us and the ice. Static hissed and popped, then, through the noise, Eris heard it, faint, distorted voices. You're hearing things. He went back to the winch, his movements brusque. Eris listened again, straining his ears. The sounds were gone, replaced by the moan of the wind and the distant rumble of the glacier. Leaned closer, adjusting the tuning knob with a trembling hand. It sounded like singing. A mournful, he felt a flush of embarrassment. Of course Jens was right. Auditory pareidolia. His brain, starved for stimulation-like melody, sung by multiple male voices, barely discernible through the ocean of static. Then, a snatch, was creating patterns out of random noise. He was a scientist, for God's sake. Yet, back of conversation, English, but with an older, clipped accent, should have turned back, the ice, in the lab that evening, reviewing the audio logs from the sensor he'd just retrieved, he found something. Burlesons. The signal faded. Swallowed by a fresh wave of static, then silence. Eris stared at tide deep within the normal spectrum of glacial noise, the groans, the cracks, the hiss of wind, was a faint, anomalous the radio, his blood running cold. He checked the frequency. It wasn't tuned to any known active channel. Frequency. When he isolated and amplified it, a shiver traced its way down his spine. It wasn't clear. Tried hailing, station Hyperion to unknown transmission, do you read? Over. Only the hiss of empty airwaves, not by any means, but it had a distinct, almost melodic cadence. The voices, he thought. He answered. He replayed the moment in his mind. The song, the fragmented sentence. It couldn't be. Imagined. He played it for Jens. The engineer listened, his head cocked, then shrugged. Sounds it was too specific, too coincidental. He spent the next hour trying to reacquire the signal, sweeping through the bands, but found nothing. Had he imagined it? Auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find like feedback. Or maybe interference from the aurora. We get weird stuff on the instruments sometimes. This isn't feedback. Patterns in random noise, was a known phenomenon, especially under stress and in isolation. He saved the recording from Eris insisted, his voice tight. The pattern is too regular, too structured. Jens just grunted. Whatever you say, document. Just don't go chasing ghosts. Nibelheim's Tooth has claimed lab's audio logger, then meticulously analyzed the segment containing the radio burst. The spectral analysis showed anomalous energy spikes coinciding with the perceived voices, but the signals were too degraded, too buried in noise to be definitive. That night, enough folks without us adding to the tally. The remark, casual as it was, sent another chill through Eris. Found Jens in the galley, staring into a cup of lukewarm coffee. Jens, Eris began, trying claimed folks. Old stories, Jens said, already turning away. Lost expeditions. Whalers from way back. To sound casual, did you by any chance hear anything unusual on the shortwave earlier? Around 18:3 this place has a reputation. Best not to dwell on it. But Eris couldn't let it go. That's zero. Jens looked up, his eyes narrowed. Shortwave's been nothing but hash all day. Solar night, instead of working on his glacial models, he delved into Station Hyperion's limited digital archives. Interference, like I said. Why? Just, thought I picked up a faint signal. Couldn't make it. Found scant references, a brief mention of a missing 19th century Danish survey team, a garbled report out. Eris didn't want to mention the voices, the song. Not yet. He needed more than of a whaling ship crushed in the ice near the fjord leading to Nibelheim's Tooth. Nothing concrete. Then fleeting, static-laced anomaly. Jens grunted. Probably just echoes. This place is full of them. He found it, a heavily redacted file, cryptically labeled, Kestrel_incident_1957. Most sound bounces off the ice, gets trapped in the valleys. You hear all sorts of strange things if you listen long enough. Of it was inaccessible, classified by an obscure British Antarctic survey code. But there was a single, short, unread. He took a sip of his coffee. Or if you want to hear them. Eris felt a flush of irritation at the implied skepticism, a feeling all too familiar from the aftermath of the Polaris event. It wasn't an acted memo, search and rescue operation for Kestrel expedition, Nibelheim's Tooth sector, officially concluded. No echo, Jens. It sounded like a broadcast. Jens shrugged, his expression unreadable. Could be some survivors found. Presumed lost to extreme weather event. Recommend area be designated hazardous and restricted for future survey. The K Oldham radio operator bouncing signals off the ionosphere. Or just the ice singing its usual tunes. He pushed his Kestrel expedition. He vaguely remembered reading something about them during his doctoral research, a footnote in a paper on early Greenlandic away. Don't let this place get to you, Doctor. It plays tricks. Eris left the galley glaciology. They had been trying to drill ice cores, innovative for their time. What had happened to them? An extreme weather event seemed a convenient, all-encompassing explanation in such a harsh environment. He tried to access feeling more unsettled than before. Jens's easy dismissal, his casual mention of the ice, singing, echoed his own disturbing dream experiences and the unsettling hum. Was it a common turn of phrase among those stationed here long-term, away of the restricted files, using old university backdoors he knew, but the encryption was robust. Frustrated, he leaned back, personifying the desolate environment. Or did Jens know more than he was letting on? Back in his lab, Eris stared, the faint hum of the station's life support seeming louder in the silence of his module. His dreams that night were more disturbing. He was no longer an observer of the ice structures. He was inside them, trapped, the cold pressing in. And at the silent radio. The ice listens. The phrase resonated with a chilling familiarity. He pulled out a battered, waterproof. The voices were clearer, whispering in a language he didn't understand but felt an unsettling, primal familiarity with. The trunk that had been shipped with his primary equipment, a trunk he hadn't yet opened. It contained archived materials related weren't threatening, not exactly. They were, curious. Probing. He woke up sweating, despite the chill, to Nibelheim's Tooth, old survey maps, geological reports, and, he now remembered with a jolt, in the module, the phantom whispers still echoing in the silence. The next morning, he noticed something odd. On copies of any surviving records from previous expeditions to the area. With a growing sense of trepidation, he unlatched the trunk. Inside, nestled amongst faded blueprints and dusty geological surveys, was a slim, oilskin-wrapped. His small desk, next to the photograph of Lily, was a small, perfectly smooth, gray stone. It hadn't been there before. He picked it up. It was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so. He didn't remember finding package. He carefully unwrapped it. It was a facsimile of a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Even it, or bringing it inside. He certainly hadn't seen it among his belongings. He frowned, turning it over in the reproduction. The embossed title on the cover was barely legible, Kestrel Expedition, Nibelheim Survey, Dr. A. Finch. His heart hammered against his ribs. The Kestrel Expedition. The lost 195 fingers. Had Jens left it? Why? It was just a stone. He placed it back on the desk, a tiny knot of unease tightening in his stomach. His rational mind scrambled for an explanation. He must have picked it up unconsciously. 0's British team. He'd read the official reports, of course, a tragic tale of an experienced team vanishing without on the ice yesterday, and pocketed it. His memory was just a little frayed from stress and lack of sleep. A trace, presumed victims of a sudden storm or a catastrophic crevasse fall. But this was a primary source. With trembling fingers, Eris opened the journal to the first entry. Underscore 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 underscore. This is another, perfectly normal, he told himself, his voice lacking conviction even in his own head. But as he walked to 1100 words, bringing the total to around 2100. We're now introducing the lab. The vast, silent expanse of white outside the walkway windows seemed to hold a new, watchful quality. Ancestral Expeditions Journal, a key element for Eris to delve into the mystery. How is the pacing and development? The wind, whistling around the corners of the modules, sounded less like an indifferent force of nature and more like a drawn feeling. Ready for Chapter 3, where Eris starts reading Finch's journal and the initial psychological manifestations might begin to subtly affect him. Chapter 3, The Kestrel's Lament. The facsimile of Dr. Alastair Finch's journal felt unnervingly real in Eris's hands. The reproduced texture of the worn leather cover, the faint water stains on the copied pages, even a phantom scent of old paper and something vaguely chemical, it all contributed to a sense of stepping back in time. He cleared a space on his lab bench, adjusted the anglepoise lamp, and began to read. Finch's early entries, dated early summer 1957, were what Eris expected, meticulous, scientific, and filled with the cautious optimism of a new expedition. He detailed the establishment of their base camp, a cluster of heavy canvas tents and a prefabricated hut, situated a few kilometers further up the fjord from where Station Hyperion now stood, closer to the then terminus of Nibelheim's Tooth. There were notes on weather patterns, initial ice core sample attempts, magnetic field readings, and the challenges of operating their rudimentary drilling equipment in the harsh conditions. The Kestrel team consisted of 5 men: Finch, the lead geologist and glaciologist, a meteorologist named Davies, a young physicist, Armitage, responsible for their experimental seismic gear, and 2 experienced polar hands, McCready and Evans, for logistics and support. Finch wrote of them with a detached affection, noting their quirks and strengths. June 12, 1957. McCready managed to coax the generator back to life after another temperamental fit. The man has a magician's touch with recalcitrant machinery. Davies complains incessantly about the cold, a curious affliction for a meteorologist, but his readings are impeccable. Armitage is brimming with theories about subglacial structures, eager to deploy his thumper. Young Evans is quiet, efficient, misses his sweetheart back in Cardiff, if his constant rereading of her letters is any indication. Eris found himself warming to Finch. The man's prose was clear. His observations astute. For several hours, he was engrossed, following the Kestrel team's initial struggles and small triumphs. Then, about 3 weeks into the journal, the tone began to shift, subtly at first. July 5, 1957. A peculiar stillness today. The wind dropped completely, which is rare. The silence is almost palpable. Evans mentioned hearing odd sounds last night, like distant singing, but attributed it to the ice settling. I confess, the glacier does seem to groan more than usual. Perhaps the recent thaw is causing increased internal stress. A familiar prickle ran down Eris's spine. Distant singing. Ice settling. He thought of the radio transmission, Jens's casual remarks. A few days later. July 9, 1957. Davies reported vivid, unsettling dreams shared by himself and Armitage, something about vast, echoing caverns beneath the ice. I dismissed it as cabin fever, the power of suggestion. We are isolated, after all. However, I too have felt a certain heaviness in my sleep. A sense of being observed. Eris paused, his own dream of glowing ice structures flashing in his mind. He looked around the empty lab, the hum of the equipment suddenly feeling less benign. He got up, poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the pot Jens kept perpetually brewing, and forced himself to continue. This was historical data, nothing more. A record of psychological stress in an extreme environment. But Finch's entries became increasingly disquieting. He wrote of equipment malfunctions, compasses spinning erratically, radio signals failing without explanation, even their carefully calibrated chronometers losing or gaining time. These were minor at first, easily dismissed as environmental interference or faulty gear. July 18, 1957. The seismic readings Armitage is getting are bizarre. Not earthquake tremors, but rhythmic pulses. Almost like a heartbeat, deep beneath Nibelheim's tooth. He's excited, talking about undiscovered geothermal activity. I'm less certain. There's a quality to them, an organized pattern that feels unnatural. Eris's own seismic sensors had picked up similar rhythmic tremors. He'd flagged them as anomalous, requiring further investigation. He hadn't, however, thought of them as a heartbeat. The anthropomorphism was unsettling. The entries detailing the team's psychological state grew more frequent. Finch mentioned increasing irritability among the men, bouts of inexplicable melancholia, and a shared paranoia. July 25, 1957. McCready flew into a rage today over a misplaced wrench. Accused Evans of hiding it. The tension in the hut is thick enough to cut with a knife. Even I feel on edge, prone to vivid daydreams that leave me disoriented. Last night, I distinctly remembered a conversation with my late father, a conversation that never happened. The clarity was astonishing. For a moment, it felt more real than my present surroundings. Substituted memories, Eris thought, a cold dread seeping into him. He recalled his own fleeting memory of the Kestrel expedition days earlier, a sensation he dismissed as a microsleep hallucination. Could it be a documented symptom of prolonged exposure to, what? Extreme isolation? Undetected atmospheric toxins released by the thaw. Finch, ever the scientist, tried to rationalize. He wrote of potential carbon monoxide poisoning from their stove, of vitamin deficiencies, of the psychological toll of constant daylight followed by the encroaching darkness of the polar autumn. But an undercurrent of deeper fear, of something beyond rational explanation, began to permeate his writing. August 3, 1957. The singing is more frequent now. We all hear it, especially at dusk. It's not the wind. It's structured. Melodic, almost. Davies claims he can almost make out words, though no one agrees on what they are. He's becoming withdrawn, sits for hours staring at the ice face of the glacier. Armitage is convinced it's some form of complex geological resonance, amplified by the ice sheet. He's trying to record it, but the sounds overload his equipment, producing only static or that damnable, low hum. That hum. The same hum Eris had heard. The same hum he'd found on his own audio logs. He pushed back from the bench, his hands clammy. This was too much. Too many parallels. He stood up and paced the confines of the lab, the smooth gray stone he'd found earlier inexplicably catching his eye from his desk. He picked it up. It was still cold, almost vibrating with a faint energy he hadn't noticed before, or perhaps had only now allowed himself to perceive. He forced himself back to the journal. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. Finch's neat, scientific script became spidery, erratic. August 10, 1957. Evans is gone. Vanished from his bunk during the night. No tracks. We searched for hours. McCready swears he saw him walking towards the glacier, as if summoned. He's losing his grip. We all are. The ice, it. August 14, 1957. Davies won't speak. Just hums that awful melody we hear from the ice. His eyes are empty. Armitage keeps muttering about the listener, about a mind in the ice. He says it's ancient, awakened by our drilling, our signals. He says it's learning from us. I fear he may be right. My own thoughts feel invaded. Alien desires, memories that aren't mine, whisper at the edges of my consciousness. The listener. The mind in the ice. Eris felt a wave of nausea. The hair on his arms stood on end. He closed the journal, unable to read further for a moment. He looked at his own sophisticated equipment, his arrays of sensors designed to parse the rational, physical world. What if the anomaly he was studying wasn't merely geological or climatological? What if Finch and Armitage, in their descent into madness, had stumbled upon a terrifying truth? He took several deep breaths, trying to regain his composure. He was Dr. Eris Thorne, a scientist. This was a historical account of mass hysteria, a tragic case study. There had to be a rational explanation for the Kestrel team's demise, and for the strange phenomena he himself was experiencing. But as he reached for his coffee cup, his hand brushed against the small, smooth gray stone on his desk. For a fleeting second, under the harsh fluorescent light of the lab, he thought he saw a faint, intricate pattern glowing within its depths, like a submerged constellation. He blinked, and it was gone. Just a plain gray stone. You're tired, he told himself fiercely. You're projecting. Finch's journal is getting to you. Yet, when he finally gathered the courage to reopen the journal, his gaze fell upon one of Finch's last, almost illegible entries. August 19, 1957. It shows us what we want. Or what it thinks we want. Rooms appear, places from our past. The old lab at Cambridge. Mum's kitchen. It's trying to understand. Or to lure us. McCready walked into one. Hasn't come back. Only Armitage and I left. He's barricaded himself in the radio hut, trying to send a warning. I don't think the signal will get through. The listener, it distorts everything. It's in my head now. I hear its thoughts, so cold, so vast. Rooms that weren't there. Eris remembered his own fleeting vision of the 1950s medical bay. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He had to talk to Jens. Chapter 4, Cracks in the Rational. The walk from Lab 1 to the main module, Alpha, where the galley and Jens's quarters were located, felt longer than usual. The metallic walkways clanged under Eris's boots with a hollow, accusatory sound. The wind, no longer a mere atmospheric phenomenon, seemed to keen around the station, carrying phantom whispers that mimicked Finch's desperate scrawls. He found Jens in the galley, meticulously cleaning a heavy-duty cooking pot, his movements economical and precise. The aroma of strong coffee still hung in the air, a small comfort of normalcy in the rapidly destabilizing world Eris felt himself inhabiting. Jens, Eris began, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. Jens glanced up, his expression neutral, but Eris thought he saw a flicker of something, wariness, in his pale eyes. Document. Everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. In a manner of speaking. Eris pulled out one of the bolted-down chairs and sat, placing the facsimile of Finch's journal on the table between them. I found this. In the archives. The Kestrel expedition. Jens continued scrubbing the pot for a moment, his back to Eris. Then he sighed, a sound like air escaping a leaky bellows, and turned, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the journal, then at Eris, his gaze steady. So you did. Figured you might, sooner or later. Bright fellow like yourself. You knew about this? Eris felt a surge of frustration. You knew what happened to them? The singing, the psychological effects. Jens leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Knew of them. Knew the stories. Knew the official report was a load of bull. Extreme weather event, he scoffed. Weather here's always extreme. Doesn't make 5 experienced men vanish into thin air, leaving their camp mostly intact. Finch's journal describes things I've been experiencing. Eris's voice was tight. The humming sound. Vivid dreams. That radio broadcast. I think it might have been them, or echoes of them. And he mentions rooms appearing. Places that weren't there. Eris watched Jens's face intently, searching for any sign of recognition, of shared experience. Jens's expression remained impassive, but he looked down at the journal, then back at Eris. This place. Niflheim's Tooth, it's old, document older than the ice, some say. There are legends, from the old Inuit. They called this area the place where the air listens, or something like that. Said spirits lived in the ice, spirits that could get into your head. Show you things, make you walk away and never come back. Spirits? Eris fought to keep the incredulity out of his voice. Jens, I'm a scientist. I'm looking for a rational explanation. And what's Finch's rational explanation? Jens gestured towards the journal. A mind in the ice. A listener. Sounds pretty out there for a scientist, wouldn't you say? Eris flinched. Jens had a point. He was under extreme duress. They all were. But the parallels to what I've sensed are too strong to ignore. He leaned forward. Have you experienced any of it, Jens? The sounds? The distortions? Jens was silent for a long moment, staring out the small galley window at the oppressive darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I've been stationed in the Arctic, one remote outpost or another, for 20 years, seen a lot of strange things. Heard a lot of strange things. You learn to filter it out. You learn what to ignore if you want to stay sane. He met Eris's gaze. This station, Hyperion, it's newer. But the land it's on, it's the same old land. Some places are just wrong. This is one of them. So you have experienced something, Eris pressed. I've heard the hum, Jens admitted reluctantly. Sometimes, when the wind's right, or when the ice is particularly active. And yeah, sometimes you think you see things out of the corner of your eye. Lights on the glacier when there shouldn't be. Shadows moving where nothing's casting them. You chalk it up to fatigue, to the light playing tricks. You have to. But Finch describes actual hallucinations, shared delusions, people vanishing. Like I said, Doc, this place has a reputation. Jens pushed himself off the counter. Finch and his men weren't the first, probably won't be the last. My advice? Stick to your instruments. Collect your data on the Thal. Don't go chasing Inuit spirits or the ghosts of the Kestrel expedition. It's a path to madness. But what if my instruments are detecting the source of it? Eris insisted, a desperate edge to his voice. The anomalous energy readings, the rhythmic seismic pulses. What if it's all connected? Jens shook his head slowly. Some doors are best left unopened, Dr. Thorne. Some things are best left buried under the ice. He picked up the pot he'd been cleaning. Dinner's at 1900. Try and get some rest. He left the galley, leaving Eris alone with Finch's journal and a host of new, terrifying questions. Jens's guarded admissions, his reluctant confirmations, did little to reassure Eris. Instead, they validated the chilling possibility that the horrors Finch described were not mere figments of a deteriorating mind, but objective, albeit inexplicable, phenomena tied to this specific location. He returned to Lab 1, the weight of Finch's words pressing down on him. He tried to focus on his data, on the charts and graphs that had always been his anchor in a sea of uncertainty. But now, even the numbers seemed tainted. The rhythmic seismic pulses from Niflheim's Tooth no longer looked like mere geological anomalies, they felt like the measured breaths of something ancient and aware. The temperature fluctuations deep within the ice hinted at an unnatural, internal heat. That afternoon, as he was reviewing telemetry from a sensor array near a large, newly opened crevasse, the main lights in Lab 1 flickered violently, then died, plunging him into near darkness, illuminated only by the emergency backup lights and the glow of his monitor screens. "Jens," he called into his comm unit, his voice tight. "Power fluctuation in Lab 1. Static answered him for a moment, then Jens's voice, strained. "Acknowledged, Eris. Generators, acting up. Seeing massive power drains across the station. Stand by." Eris sat in the dim, humming lab, his heart pounding. A power outage was not unusual in such an environment, but combined with everything else. He looked around, his senses suddenly heightened. The hum of his own equipment seemed louder, more insistent. And beneath it, almost imperceptible, was that other hum, the one Finch had written about, the one he'd heard himself. It seemed stronger now, closer. Then, from the far corner of the lab, a shadowy area where spare equipment was stored, he saw movement. A flicker, a distortion in the dim light. He froze. "Jens," he whispered, his hand reaching for the heavy spanner he kept on his workbench. The shadows seemed to coalesce, to deepen. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a figure, tall and indistinct, standing there, watching him. He blinked, and it was gone. Just stacked crates and draped tarpaulins. The main lights flickered back on, painfully bright after the gloom. "Power stabilizing, Eris," Jens's voice crackled over the comm, "had to reset the primary breaker. Damn thing nearly overloaded. You okay?" "Fine," Eris managed, his voice hoarse. "Just, shadows." He knew Jens wouldn't understand. He barely understood it himself. But the image of that fleeting figure, the oppressive sense of being watched, lingered. His rational mind screamed fatigue, stress, tricks of the light. But another part of him, a newly awakened, terrified part, whispered that the cracks in his carefully constructed reality were widening, and something was beginning to seep through. He looked down at Finch's journal, still open on the bench. The spidery handwriting seemed to mock him. "It shows us what we want. Or what it thinks we want." What had he wanted to see in that corner? Or what had it wanted him to see? The smooth gray stone on his desk seemed to pulse with a faint, cold light, a silent, knowing presence in the sterile lab. Chapter 5, Substituted Realities. The power fluctuations continued sporadically throughout the evening. Unsettling jolts that frayed Eris's already taut nerves. Each flicker of the lights, each burst of static over the comms, seemed to carry a heightened significance, a potential prelude to something worse. Jens, when Eris inquired, grumbled about aging equipment and the unusual atmospheric conditions affecting the solar panels that supplemented their main generator, but his explanations felt thin, perfunctory. Eris tried to immerse himself in Finch's journal again, hoping to find some pattern, some clue that the Kestrel team had overlooked, some rational explanation for their descent. But reading it now was like staring into a distorted mirror. Finch's anxieties, his dawning horror, resonated too closely with Eris's own growing unease. He found himself rereading the passage about substituted memories with a morbid fascination. "Last night, I distinctly remembered a conversation with my late father, a conversation that never happened." The clarity was astonishing. Eris had always prided himself on his sharp memory, his ability to recall data, faces, conversations with precision. It was a cornerstone of his scientific rigor. The idea of that faculty being compromised, of his own mind betraying him with false recollections, was deeply disturbing. He tried to focus on processing the latest data from Nibelheim's tooth. The seismic tremors were becoming more regular, their rhythm almost hypnotic. The thermal anomalies were spreading, like an infection, deeper into the glacier. As he stared at a complex 3D model of the subglacial terrain, his screen suddenly pixelated, the image fracturing into a kaleidoscope of colors before resolving into something entirely different. For a dizzying moment, he wasn't looking at a geological survey of Greenland. He was looking at a star chart, specifically the constellation Orion, but with subtle, unfamiliar nebulae glowing around Betelgeuse. And he knew it. He knew the names of those nebulae, their spectral signatures, their distance from Earth. He remembered charting them, years ago, during a postgraduate research project on stellar evolution. He blinked, shaking his head, and the image on the screen reverted to the mundane topography of Nibelheim's Tooth. His heart hammered. He'd never done a postgraduate project on stellar evolution. His entire academic career had been focused on Earth sciences, on climatology. What the hell was that? He quickly checked the computer's system logs. No anomalies, no unauthorized access, no malware. It was as if the fleeting image had been projected directly into his perception, bypassing the machine. He stood up, a cold sweat on his brow, and walked over to the small window of Lab 1. The polar night was absolute, a suffocating blanket of black. He saw his own reflection staring back, pale and wide-eyed. And for a split second, superimposed over his own face, he saw another, older, bearded, with eyes that held a deep, ancient weariness. Dr. Alastair Finch. Eris recoiled from the window as if burned, stumbling back against a workbench. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his palms against them. This isn't real. Stress. Isolation. Suggestion from the journal. When he opened them again, his reflection was his own, albeit a terrified version of it. He needed to ground himself, to reassert the boundaries of his reality. He grabbed his comm unit. Jens? Eris? Are you seeing anything unusual with the comm system? Any visual interference on your monitors? Jens's reply was laced with static, but his voice was characteristically gruff. Negative, Eris. Comms are noisy, as usual, but no visual. What kind of visual interference? Nothing. Just, screen flicker. My mistake. He couldn't bring himself to describe what he'd seen, what he'd remembered. Jens would think he was losing his mind. Perhaps he was. He spent the next hour performing meticulous diagnostic checks on all his equipment, then on himself. He took his pulse, his temperature. Normal. He even ran through a series of cognitive tests he'd downloaded before the expedition, memory recall, pattern recognition. He passed them all flawlessly. His rational mind clung to these anchors. The fleeting images, the false memories, they had to be products of an overstressed psyche. The journal was a potent contaminant, seeding his imagination with its lurid anxieties. Yet, as he tried to settle back to work, a new, unsettling sensation began to creep over him. A feeling of mental intrusion. It wasn't voices, not yet. It was more like a subtle pressure at the edges of his thoughts, a faint, alien curiosity trying to peer in. He found his own train of thought derailing, his focus wavering, as if someone else were trying to change the subject of his internal monologue. He'd be analyzing a dataset, and suddenly an unrelated image would flash through his mind, a childhood memory he hadn't revisited in years, the scent of his mother's baking, the sting of a forgotten playground injury. They were his own memories, but their sudden, vivid intrusion felt orchestrated, unbidden. He pushed back from his desk, unable to concentrate. He needed air, even if it was the recycled, slightly stale air of the station's walkways. He decided to check the meteorological sensors on the station's exterior mast. A mundane, physical task. Something to clear his head. The walkways were eerily quiet, the usual creaks and groans of the station amplified in the silence. As he passed the entrance to Module Gamma, an unused storage unit according to the station schematics, he paused. The door, usually sealed, was slightly ajar. A sliver of warm, yellow light spilled out into the dimly lit corridor. And he heard music. Faint, tinny, but unmistakable. A popular song from his university days, one he and his then-girlfriend, later his ex-wife, had often danced to. His heart constricted. This was impossible. Module Gamma was supposed to be empty, unpowered. Driven by a mixture of dread and a desperate need to understand, he pushed the door open. It wasn't a storage unit. He was looking into a small, cluttered bedsit, instantly recognizable. Peeling floral wallpaper, a sagging armchair draped with a knitted throw, a formica table with two mismatched mugs. It was the bedsit he'd shared with Sarah during their final year at university, 2 decades ago, a world away. And Sarah. Sarah was there, younger, her hair shorter, smiling at him from the armchair, a book open in her lap. "Eris? You're back early," she said, her voice exactly as he remembered it, warm, a little teasing. "Tea's just brewed." Eris stared, his mind reeling, unable to process the scene. This couldn't be. It was a memory, a hallucination, a waking dream of impossible clarity. He could smell the faint scent of her lavender soap, the dusty aroma of old books that had permeated that tiny apartment. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. She frowned, a look of concern clouding her youthful face. "Are you all right, love? You look like you've seen a ghost." The same words Jens had used. The intrusive pressure in his mind intensified, and with it, a seductive whisper, not auditory, but a feeling, a suggestion: "This is real. This is what you want. Stay." For a terrifying moment, he wanted to. He wanted to step into that warm, familiar room, to leave behind the ice, the fear, the crushing weight of his failures. He wanted to be that younger Eris again, full of hope and love, before the Polaris event, before the bitterness and the regret. His hand reached for the doorframe. Then, through the haze of the illusion, a sharper memory cut through, Lily's gap-toothed smile from the photograph on his desk. His daughter. His present. His responsibility. The illusion wavered, like heat haze over tarmac. Sarah's face flickered, her smile becoming strained, her eyes hollowing. The warm light dimmed. The scent of lavender was replaced by the cold, metallic tang of the Arctic air. With a gasp, Eris stumbled back, slamming the door shut. He leaned against the cold metal of the walkway, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling. He fumbled for his calm, "Jens. Jens, get to Module Gamma. Now." He didn't wait for a reply. He threw open the door to Module Gamma again. It was a storage unit. Dark, cold, filled with stacked crates, discarded equipment, and the thick smell of dust and disuse. No bedsit. No Sarah. No music. He frantically searched the small space, his hands patting down crates, peering into shadowy corners. Nothing. It was exactly as it should be. Jens arrived a minute later, his face etched with concern, a heavy wrench in his hand. "Eris? What's wrong? You sounded panicked." Eris could only stare at the mundane storage unit, then back at Jens, his carefully constructed rationality shattered into a million pieces. It wasn't. "I saw," he couldn't articulate it. How could he explain that he'd just had a conversation with a memory in a room that didn't exist? Jens looked from Eris's wild eyes to the innocuous storage module, then back again. He didn't ask questions. He simply placed a heavy hand on Eris's shoulder. "Come on, Doc," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Let's get you back to your lab. You need to sit down. And maybe we need to talk about getting you on the next supply flight out of here." Chapter 6, The Logic of Fear. Jens's suggestion of leaving hung in the frigid air of Lab 1 like a death knell. Or perhaps, Eris thought with a surge of bitter irony, a lifeline. He sat hunched on a stool, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of overly sweet tea Jens had pressed upon him, the tremor in his fingers still noticeable. "I'm not leaving," Eris said, his voice raspy but firm. The word surprised even himself. A few hours ago, the thought of escaping this icebound madhouse would have been a profound relief. Now, it felt like surrender. Like letting it win. Jens, who had been observing him with a quiet, assessing gaze, sighed. "Doc, with all due respect, you're not doing so good. What you described back there, that's not just stress. That's, Well, that's what happened to Finch's men, isn't it? Before they walked off into the ice. It was a hallucination, Eris insisted, clinging to the tattered remnants of his rationality. A vivid, stress-induced hallucination, triggered by Finch's journal and the isolation. Even as he said it, the memory of Sarah's voice, the scent of her lavender soap, felt undeniably, terrifyingly real. Maybe, Jens conceded, though his tone was skeptical. But this place, it feeds on that. It finds the cracks and worms its way in. You're a smart man, Eris, but you're not immune. No one is. I have work to do, Eris said, gesturing vaguely towards his silent monitors. The anomaly at Niflheim's tooth, it's real. The data is undeniable. I can't just abandon it. The Polaris event loomed large in his mind. Running away now would be another failure, another stain on his reputation, confirming every whispered doubt about his stability. But deeper than that, a new, cold resolve was forming. If this entity was real, if it was responsible for the Kestrel tragedy and was now targeting him, then understanding it, exposing it, was no longer just a scientific imperative. It was a matter of survival, perhaps even a duty. Jens ran a hand through his thinning hair. And what if the anomaly is what's doing this to you? What if studying it is like staring into the sun? You're getting closer to something dangerous, Eris. Something that doesn't want to be understood, or maybe it wants to be understood too well. Eris had no answer to that. The thought that his very subject of study might be actively malevolent, or at least psychically invasive, was a terrifying paradigm shift. I need to document this, Eris said, more to himself than to Jens. Objectively. If these manifestations are occurring, they need to be recorded, analyzed. There has to be a pattern, a mechanism. His scientific training, his pathological rationality, was reasserting itself, albeit in a desperate, almost manic way. If he could categorize the horror, perhaps he could control it. Jens shook his head, a look of pity in his eyes. You can't outthink this thing, document. It's not a problem you can solve with equations. He stood up. All right. I can't force you to leave. But I'm keeping a closer eye on you. And the comms stay open between us at all times. Any sign you're slipping, and I'm calling in that flight myself, whether you like it or not. For your own good. Eris nodded, a strange mixture of resentment and gratitude swirling within him. He was being treated like a fragile patient, yet Jens's gruff concern was perhaps the only thing keeping him tethered to some semblance of shared reality. After Jens left, Lab 1 felt colder, emptier. Eris stared at his equipment, trying to formulate a plan. How did one scientifically investigate an entity that manifested as personalized hallucinations and manipulated memories? Traditional sensors were useless against such an opponent. He decided to start with himself. He began a meticulous log, detailing every anomalous perception, every intrusive thought, every flicker of unreality. He noted times, durations, environmental conditions, his own emotional state. He would be his own primary instrument, his mind the sensor array. The entity, however, seemed to have shifted tactics. The dramatic, overwhelming hallucinations like the bedsit incident did not immediately recur. Instead, the pressure was more subtle, more insidious. He would be working, and suddenly find that a crucial data file was subtly corrupted, numbers transposed, timestamps altered by a few minutes, just enough to sow doubt, to make him question his own meticulousness. He would reach for a tool on his workbench and find it wasn't where he distinctly remembered leaving it, only for it to reappear there minutes later, as if mocking him. The substituted memories became more frequent, but less dramatic. He'd find himself humming a tune he didn't consciously know, then realize with a jolt it was one of the faint melodies Finch had described as emanating from the ice. He'd use an archaic turn of phrase in his notes, then stare at it, wondering where it had come from, only to find a similar expression later in Finch's journal. It was as if fragments of the Kestrel expedition's consciousness, or the entity's interpretation of them, were slowly, subtly being woven into the fabric of his own mind. The dreams continued, evolving. He no longer just saw the vast, glowing ice structures, he felt he was part of them, his awareness merging with their cold, ancient geometry. The whispering voices in the dreams were clearer now, speaking in a cacophony of languages, English with Finch's clipped accent, what sounded like archaic Norse, snatches of Inuit dialects, and underlying it all, a sibilant, non-human tongue that resonated deep within his bones. They weren't directed at him, but seemed to be an internal chorus of the ice itself, a vast, collective consciousness. He started to lose track of time more frequently. He'd glance at the clock, see it was mid-afternoon, then look again a moment later and find that hours had passed, the lab now bathed in the artificial twilight of the station's night cycle. He had no memory of the intervening period. These lost hours terrified him. What was he doing? What was it doing with his mind, his body, during those blanks? The smooth gray stone on his desk became a focal point of his growing paranoia. He was certain it was changing. Sometimes it seemed darker, almost black, other times, it seemed to hold a faint, internal luminescence. He tried to get rid of it once, intending to hurl it out onto the ice. But as he reached for it, a wave of intense nausea and dizziness washed over him, so profound he had to sit down, gasping. When the feeling passed, the stone was still there, seemingly innocuous. He didn't try to touch it again. One evening, while reviewing his audio logs, he heard something new. Amidst the usual hum and the faint, distorted whispers he was becoming accustomed to, there was another sound, his own voice. He was speaking, calmly and clearly, reciting a series of complex equations. Equations he didn't recognize, related to a branch of theoretical physics he had only a passing familiarity with. Yet, the voice was undeniably his, confident, authoritative. The recording was time-stamped during one of his lost periods of time. A cold dread, colder than any Arctic wind, settled over him. It wasn't just showing him things anymore. It wasn't just implanting memories. It was using him. His mind, his knowledge, his voice. He looked at his reflection in a darkened monitor screen. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed, holding a wild, hunted look. The rational scientist was fading, replaced by a man teetering on the brink of an abyss. The logic of fear was simple, if he couldn't understand it, it would consume him. And he was beginning to suspect that understanding it might be the same thing as being consumed. Chapter 7, The Signal in the Noise. The recording of his own voice speaking unknown equations played on a loop in Eris's mind, a chilling testament to his diminishing autonomy. He was no longer just an observer of the anomaly, he was becoming its instrument. The realization spurred him past fear into a desperate, almost reckless resolve. Passive documentation was not enough. He needed to provoke a response, to force the entity's hand, to understand the rules of this horrifying engagement. His gaze fell upon the communications array in Lab 1. The shortwave radio that had delivered the ghostly Kestrel broadcast, the satellite uplink that was his tenuous connection to the outside world. Finch had written that Armitage believed their radio signals had somehow awakened, or attracted, the listener. What if he could use those same frequencies, not just to listen, but to transmit? To send a signal into the ice, a deliberate probe? It was a wildly unscientific, potentially dangerous idea. If the entity was indeed sensitive to such transmissions, what would a direct, focused signal provoke? Jens's warnings about not poking the sleeping bear echoed in his mind. But the alternative, a slow, inexorable descent into madness, his mind eroded piece by piece, was even less palatable. He began by analyzing the anomalous energy signatures he'd recorded, particularly the rhythmic seismic pulses and the strange frequencies embedded in the hum. He theorized that these might be the entity's natural frequencies, its baseline resonance. If he could mimic those frequencies, perhaps amplify them, he might elicit a more coherent response than the fragmented, chaotic manifestations he'd experienced so far. He spent a day reconfiguring a section of his sensor array, turning directional transmitters towards the heart of Nibelheim's tooth. He wrote a simple, repeating algorithm, a sequence of prime numbers, a universal marker of intelligence, followed by a modulated pulse designed to mirror the seismic rhythms he'd recorded. It was a shot in the dark, a message in a bottle tossed into an alien ocean. Jens, observing Eris's feverish activity with growing concern, confronted him. "What in blazes are you rigging up now, Doc? That looks suspiciously like you're trying to broadcast something powerful directly at that glacier." Eris didn't try to dissemble. "I need to understand the mechanism, Jens. If it's sensitive to electromagnetic frequencies, if that's how it interacts, then this is the most direct way to test the hypothesis. And if the hypothesis is correct, and it answers back in a way we don't like." Jens's voice was grim. "You're playing with fire, Eris. Real fire this time, not just the flickering ghosts in your head. The alternative is to wait for it to completely unravel my mind," Eris retorted. His voice tight with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "At least this way, I'm taking action. I'm trying to control the experiment." "Control?" Jens scoffed. "You think you can control something that's been here since before the ice, something that swallowed the Kestrel expedition whole?" But he didn't try to stop Eris physically. Perhaps he saw the desperate resolve in Eris's eyes, or perhaps a part of him, buried deep beneath layers of stoic pragmatism, was also curious, or terrified, enough to want to see what would happen. He just shook his head. "Keep your calm open. And for God's sake, be ready to pull the plug if things go south." Eris nodded, his mouth dry. He ran a final diagnostic. All systems were nominal. He took a deep breath, his finger hovering over the activation key on his console. This was it. The point of no return. He pressed the key. For a long moment, nothing happened. The lab was silent, save for the hum of the equipment. Eris watched his monitors, his instruments scanning for any change, any response from Nibelheim's tooth. Disappointment, strangely mingled with relief, began to set in. Perhaps he'd been wrong. Perhaps it was all just. Then, a low thrum began to resonate through the floor of the lab, so deep it was felt more than heard. It grew in intensity, the equipment on the benches vibrating, a pen rattling off his console. The lights in Lab 1 flickered violently, then held, but their illumination seemed dimmer, tinged with an unhealthy yellow. On his main seismic display, the rhythmic pulses from Nibelheim's tooth surged, the graph spiking wildly, the pattern becoming almost frantically rapid. The ambient temperature in the lab, usually carefully controlled, began to plummet. Eris could see his breath misting in the air. "Jens," he yelled into his comm, his voice strained. "I'm getting a massive response. Seismic activity is off the charts. Temperature dropping. Reading it here too, Eris." Jens's voice crackled back, laced with alarm. "The whole damn station is shaking. What did you do?" The hum, the pervasive, mind-numbing hum that had become a constant undercurrent to his existence, intensified 100-fold. It filled the lab, pressing in on Eris from all sides, vibrating in his skull, his teeth, his bones. It was no longer just a sound, it was a physical presence. And then, the voices came. Not the faint, distorted whispers from his dreams or the Kestrel broadcast. These were clear, sharp, and terrifyingly close. They seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, a chorus of overlapping thoughts, images, and sensations flooding his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. He heard Finch's despair, the terror of young Evans as he walked towards the ice, Armitage's mad pronouncements about the listener. He saw fragmented images, the Kestrel camp under a blood-red aurora, the gaping maw of a crevasse, faces contorted in fear. He felt their cold, their hunger, their crushing isolation. But beneath these human echoes, there was something else. The true voice of the entity. It was ancient, vast, and utterly alien. It wasn't composed of words, but of pure, raw concepts, sensations of immense pressure, unimaginable cold, geological time, and a profound, consuming curiosity, a curiosity that was now focused entirely on him. "You seek. We are. You probe. We respond. The concepts bloomed in his mind, unbidden, overwhelming. He clutched his head, a scream tearing from his throat, lost in the cacophony. Your mind. A pattern. Interesting. Fragile. He saw, not with his eyes, but in his mind's eye, the vast, crystalline structure he had glimpsed in his dreams, but now it was impossibly complex, extending deep into the earth, glowing with an internal, frigid light. He felt its immense, slow thoughts, its awareness that spanned eons. And he felt it, examining him, his memories, his fears, his desperate scientific curiosity, like a biologist studying a microbe under a microscope. The lights in the lab exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging him into absolute darkness, save for the emergency strobes that cast stark, disjointed shadows. Alarms blared throughout the station. You are. Thorn. The Polaris event. The fear of failure. The desire for redemption. We see. We learn. His carefully constructed mental log, his attempts at objective documentation, felt laughably naive. This wasn't something he could study. It was studying him. He stumbled towards the console, desperate to shut down the transmission, to sever the connection. His fingers fumbled for the controls, his vision blurring, his mind reeling from the psychic onslaught. The ice thins. The world beyond. So many patterns. So much to integrate. The implication was terrifying. It wasn't just curious. It was hungry. Not for flesh, but for consciousness, for experience. And the thawing ice was weakening its prison. With a final, desperate lunge, his hand slammed down on the main power cutoff for the transmitter array. The overwhelming mental pressure receded, not instantly, but like a slowly ebbing tide. The deafening hum diminished, though it didn't vanish entirely, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The floor stopped trembling. Eris collapsed against the console, gasping for breath, his body drenched in cold sweat. He was alive. But something had irrevocably changed. He had touched the void, and the void had touched him back. Jens's voice, frantic, was shouting his name over the comm, barely audible above the wail of the station alarms. Eris. Eris, answer me. What the hell happened? Are you alive? Eris fumbled for his comm unit, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Alive, he managed to croak. I think I just had a conversation with God. Or the devil. And I don't think it liked being disturbed. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that his experiment hadn't given him control. It had merely announced his presence to something ancient, powerful, and now, acutely aware of him. And it knew his name. Chapter 8, The Devil's Due. The emergency strobes pulsed, casting Lab 1 in a disorienting series of stark flashes and deep shadows. Alarms still blared throughout Station Hyperion, a cacophony of sirens and synthesized warnings that did little to soothe Eris's shattered nerves. He lay slumped against the console, his limbs heavy, his mind feeling scoured raw, like an open wound. Jens burst through the lab door, a high-powered flashlight cutting a swathe through the gloom, his face a mask of alarm. Eris. Gods, man, I thought you were dead. He rushed to Eris's side, helping him into a sitting position. What happened in here? The whole station nearly tore itself apart. Eris could only shake his head, struggling to form words. The psychic onslaught had receded, but echoes of it still resonated, the pressure, the alien concepts, the chilling intimacy of the entity's awareness. I made contact, he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. It's conscious. It's vast. Jens shone the flashlight around the lab. The air was frigid, equipment was strewn about, and the acrid smell of burnt electronics hung heavy. Several monitors were dark, cracked. The main transmitter array was smoking faintly. Made contact. Eris, you nearly brought the roof down. The generator overloaded, half the circuits on the station are fried. We're running on emergency backup for critical systems only. He looked at Eris, his expression a mixture of fear and anger. What did you see? What did it say? How could he explain it? The nonverbal concepts, the terrifying scale of that alien intellect? It knows things. About me. The Polaris event. It called me by name. Eris shuddered. It spoke of integrating. Learning. It said the ice is thinning, and it sees the world beyond. Jens stared at him, his weathered face paling in the strobe lights. The anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a dawning horror. The Inuit legends, they talk about the Tornarsut, the spirits in the ice. They said they whisper to you, learn your heart, and then, they draw you in. You become part of the ice, part of their song. He swallowed hard. I thought they were just stories, warnings to keep kids from wandering off onto dangerous glaciers. This isn't a spirit, Jens, Eris said, a new, chilling certainty solidifying within him. It's something else. Something ancient. And it's not just whispering anymore. Together, they managed to silence the most immediate alarms in Lab 1, though the station-wide alerts continued their maddening chorus. Jens, his engineering instincts taking over, began assessing the damage. Main comms array is shot. Satellite uplink, may be salvageable, but it'll take time. We're cut off, Eris. No way to call for help, no way to send out your precious data, even if you wanted to. The isolation, once a background hum of dread, now slammed into Eris with full force. They were alone. Utterly alone with it. We need to try and restore primary power, Eris said, his mind slowly beginning to function again, latching onto practical problems as a defense against the overwhelming cosmic terror. If we're stuck here. If we're stuck here, we're in deep trouble, Jens finished grimly. That thing you poked. I don't think it's going to forget you. They spent the next few hours in a frantic, nerve-wracking effort to assess and repair the damage. Jens, with Eris assisting as best he could, worked tirelessly in the frigid generator module, coaxing the battered machinery back to a semblance of life. The main station lights eventually flickered back on, weak and unsteady, but infinitely preferable to the disorienting strobes. Many systems, however, remained offline. The primary heating struggled, and the temperature throughout the station plummeted, making their breath visible even indoors. As they worked, Eris recounted more of his conversation with the entity, the mental images. The feeling of being psychically dissected, the entity's chilling curiosity and its implied hunger for consciousness. Jens listened in grim silence, his usual stoicism replaced by a palpable fear. So Finch's listener wasn't just madness, Jens said finally, wiping grease and sweat from his brow as they sat exhausted in the weakly lit galley, nursing lukewarm cups of instant coffee. It was real. And it's still here. More awake than ever, thanks to the thaw, and maybe thanks to you. There was no accusation in his voice, only a weary resignation. I had to know, Eris said quietly. I couldn't just let it happen. And now you know, Jens replied. Now we both know. And I wish to God we didn't. He stared into his coffee cup. What do we do, Eris? We can't fight something like that. We can't reason with it. Finch and his men tried, and look what happened to them. Eris thought of the Kestrel Journal, its descent into terror and madness. Finch mentioned Armitage barricaded himself in the radio hut, trying to send a warning. He thought the entity distorted signals. If our main comms are down, sending a warning is a moot point, Jens said. And even if we could, who would believe us? Giant psychic snowflake under the ice is trying to eat our brains. They'd lock us up. The stark reality of their situation was crushing. They were trapped, isolated, with a hostile, alien intelligence of unimaginable power, an intelligence that now knew Eris intimately. As if summoned by their conversation, a low hum began to permeate the station once more. It was subtler than during the experiment, but it was undeniably there, a resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. Eris saw Jens's hand tighten around his coffee mug, his knuckles white. Then, a new sound. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, from all around them. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. What's that? Jens whispered, his eyes wide. Eris listened intently. The tapping wasn't random. It had a pattern. A familiar pattern. He felt a cold dread crawl up his spine. It's Morse code. Tap tap tap. Pause. Tap. Pause. Tap tap. SOS. It repeated, over and over, a desperate, ghostly signal tapping out from the very structure of Station Hyperion. Is that us? Jens asked, his voice barely audible. Is it trying to mimic a distress signal? Or, Eris said, his blood running cold, it's replaying one. Maybe from the Kestrel. Maybe from someone else. The tapping stopped. The hum intensified slightly. Then, from the comm unit on the galley wall, which Jens had partially repaired but which was still offline for outgoing transmissions, a voice crackled. It was distorted, filled with static, but undeniably recognizable. It was Eris's own voice. Station Hyperion to any listening frequency. This is Dr. Eris Thorne. We are under attack. The entity, it's in the station. It's in our minds. We need immediate evac. Code Polaris. I repeat, Code Polaris. It knows, the voice dissolved into a scream of static, then silence. Eris stared at the comm unit, his face ashen. That wasn't a recording of him. He'd never said those words, never sent that message. Code Polaris? It was a term he'd used internally for his current crisis, a bitter echo of his past failure. How could it know that? Jens looked at Eris, his eyes filled with a new, profound terror. It's learning fast, document. And it's using you, your voice, your fears, against us. The devil, Eris had called it. Now, it seemed the devil was demanding his due. And the price was their sanity, their very identities. Chapter 9, The Walls Have Ears, and Voices. The ghostly SOS and Eris's fabricated distress call hung in the frigid air of the galley, a chilling overture to a new phase of their torment. The entity was no longer just probing or reacting, it was actively engaging, playing a cruel, psychological game. Sleep became a luxury neither man could afford. Every creak of the station, every gust of wind, every flicker of the struggling lights, was a potential manifestation. The low hum was their constant companion, sometimes fading to a barely perceptible thrum, other times swelling to a bone-jarring vibration that made their teeth ache and their thoughts scatter. The tapping Morse code returned sporadically, an insistent, maddening rhythm that seemed to emanate from the very walls, the floor, the ceiling. Sometimes it was SOS. Other times, it spelled out single words, alone. Cold. Lost. Thorn. Jens, a man whose pragmatic stoicism had been his shield for decades, began to crack. Eris would find him staring blankly at a bulkhead, muttering to himself, or jumping at sudden noises. His engineering skills, however, remained sharp, driven by a primal need to maintain some semblance of control over their failing environment. He worked relentlessly to keep the generator running, to patch the failing heating system, his movements fueled by a grim, desperate energy. Eris, meanwhile, felt his own mind becoming a battleground. The entity's intrusions were more subtle now than the overwhelming psychic assault during his experiment, but far more insidious. He'd be in the middle of a thought, and an alien concept, cold and geometric, would slice through it. He'd experience flashes of memory that weren't his own, the taste of unfamiliar food, the feel of coarse animal hides, the sight of a starscape subtly different from Earth's. These were not the vivid, Kestrel-derived memories, but something older, stranger, hinting at the vast, ancient experiences of the entity itself. The substituted realities also became more nuanced. He wouldn't see full-blown hallucinations like the bedsit, but rather fleeting distortions. For a moment, the instruments in Lab 1 would appear ancient and corroded, as if salvaged from a wreck. The featureless ice outside the window would briefly resolve into a landscape of towering, crystalline spires under a black sun. These glimpses were so brief, so seamlessly integrated into his perception, that he constantly questioned whether he'd seen them at all, or if his mind was simply fracturing under the strain. The entity continued to use voices, but not always his own. One afternoon, as Eris was trying to repair a damaged seismometer, he heard his daughter Lily's voice, clear as day, calling, "Daddy. Are you there, Daddy?" It came from the corridor outside Lab 1. He froze, his heart lurching. He knew it was impossible. Lily was thousands of miles away, safe. But the voice was perfect, her slight lisp, the familiar cadence. He rushed to the door, yanking it open. The corridor was empty, cold, silent save for the ubiquitous hum. He leaned against the doorframe, his body trembling, tears stinging his eyes. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He told Jens. The engineer listened, his face grim. "It's learning what hurts us most, document. It's finding our weak spots." Later that day, Jens confessed, his voice barely a whisper, that he'd heard his deceased wife calling his name, asking why he'd left her alone. The smooth gray stone on Eris's desk in Lab 1 seemed to be the focal point for many of these localized phenomena. Sometimes, when he glanced at it, the air around it would shimmer, or a faint, almost inaudible chorus of whispers would seem to emanate from its direction. He developed a profound aversion to it, yet felt a strange compulsion to keep it in his line of sight, as if it were a key, a Rosetta Stone to the madness engulfing them. Their attempts to communicate with the outside world were met with chilling silence or worse. The main satellite array was beyond their ability to repair with the tools and parts on hand. Jens managed to rig up a rudimentary long-range HF radio, but their broadcasts, desperate pleas for help, warnings about the entity, were answered only by static, or occasionally, by their own voices fed back to them, distorted and mocking. "Is anyone there?" Eris would call into the microphone. And after a pause, his own voice would reply, laced with an alien amusement, "No one is coming, Dr. Thorne. You are ours now." They began to suspect the station itself was compromised, that the entity was somehow intertwined with its systems, its very structure. The lights would dim in specific patterns, the ventilation would carry faint, melodic sighs, the temperature in certain rooms would plummet inexplicably. Station Hyperion was no longer their refuge, it was the belly of the beast. "We can't stay here," Eris said one grim evening, as they huddled in the galley, the only room Jens had managed to keep relatively warm. The food supplies were dwindling, their coffee long gone, replaced by weak, bitter tea made from melted snow. "It's wearing us down. It will break us, or absorb us, just like the Kestrel crew." Jens nodded, his eyes hollow. "But where do we go?" "Out onto the ice. In this cold, with no vehicle, limited supplies. We wouldn't last 2 days." "There's the old Kestrel camp," Eris said, a desperate idea forming. Finch's journal had detailed its location. "It's further from Nibelheim's Tooth. Maybe the influence is weaker there. They had a prefabricated hut. Maybe some of their supplies are still intact, preserved by the cold." It was a slim hope, almost certainly a suicidal one. But it was better than waiting passively for their sanity to be stripped away layer by layer. "And what if it leads us there?" Jens countered. "What if that's what it wants? To play out the Kestrel story again, with us as the lead actors?" "It's a risk we have to take," Eris argued. "Remaining here is certain doom. Out there, there's a chance, however small. We could try to signal from a different location. Maybe the entity's ability to interfere with transmissions is localized around the station, around Nibelheim's Tooth." The debate raged for hours, a desperate calculus of survival. The thought of abandoning the relative, and rapidly diminishing, shelter of Hyperion for the lethal indifference of the Greenland ice sheet was terrifying. But the psychological torment, the feeling of their minds being slowly unraveled, was even more so. Finally, Jens slammed his fist on the table. All right. All right. We try for the Kestrel camp. But we go prepared. We take everything we can carry, food, fuel, tools, weapons if we can find any. And we go at first light. Every hour we spend in this damned station, we get weaker, and it gets stronger. A fragile sense of purpose returned to them, a desperate resolve born of shared terror. They began to gather supplies, their movements quick, almost frantic. Eris packed Finch's journal, his own log of manifestations, and the small, ominous gray stone. He didn't know why he took the stone, only that he felt he had to. It was a part of this, a key, and leaving it behind felt like leaving a part of himself. As they worked, the station seemed to watch them. The hum intensified, the tapping on the walls became more agitated, and the voices, faint, mocking, seductive, whispered from every shadow. You cannot escape. We are the ice. We are forever. Join us, Eris. Join us, Jens. It is so peaceful in the cold, so quiet. They ignored them, focusing on their task, their fear a cold knot in their stomachs. They were walking into the unknown, into the heart of a frozen hell, armed with little more than a desperate hope and the chilling knowledge that the walls, indeed, had ears, and voices that promised oblivion. Chapter 10, The White Labyrinth. They left Station Hyperion under a sky the color of bruised plums, the pre-dawn light struggling to penetrate the oppressive polar gloom. The tracked vehicle was long dead, its systems fried beyond repair, so they were on foot, laden with heavy packs, pulling a small, overloaded sled fashioned from a sheet of salvaged metal. The station, as they trudged away from it, looked like a forgotten, wounded animal against the vast, indifferent expanse of white. Eris didn't look back. There was nothing there for him but madness and despair. Ahead lay uncertainty, almost certain hardship, but also a sliver of hope, however irrational. The cold was a brutal, physical presence. It bit at any exposed skin, seeped through their layers of thermal clothing, and made their breath crystallize instantly. The silence, after the constant hum and tormenting voices of Hyperion, was almost deafening at first, yet it was not a peaceful silence. It was watchful, pregnant with unspoken threats. Navigating was a nightmare. Eris had Finch's hand-drawn map from the journal, and his own GPS unit, which, miraculously, still functioned, though its readings were often erratic, jumping by hundreds of meters as if the very fabric of space around Nibelheim's tooth was warped. The landscape was a disorienting maze of snowdrifts, sastrugi hard as concrete, and hidden crevasses. The glacier itself loomed to their right, a monstrous, brooding presence, its seracs and icefalls like the teeth of some colossal beast. Jens, drawing on his years of Arctic experience, took the lead, probing the snow ahead with a ski pole, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Eris followed, his gaze constantly scanning their surroundings, every shadow, every undulation in the snow, a potential threat. The entity did not let them go easily. Within hours of leaving Hyperion, the subtle torment began anew. The wind, which had been a steady, indifferent moan, started to carry phantom whispers, their names, fragments of their fears, snatches of the Kestrel crew's last despairing cries. The visual distortions returned. The snow underfoot would momentarily seem to ripple like water, or the distant ice cliffs would morph into impossible, cyclopean architecture before snapping back to reality. They pushed on, driven by a grim determination. The physical exertion was grueling. Their progress was agonizingly slow. Each kilometer felt like 10. The sled, laden with their precious supplies, caught on every ridge, bogged down in soft snow, a constant, energy-sapping burden. By what should have been midday, the sun remained a pale, ineffective smear near the horizon. They were forced to take shelter behind a large snowdrift, exhausted and chilled to the bone. As they huddled together, trying to force down frozen energy bars, Eris noticed something. Jens, he said, his voice low. Our tracks. He pointed back the way they had come. Their footprints, clearly visible in the snow just minutes before, were gone. Not covered by wind-driven snow, the air was relatively still, but simply erased. As if the white expanse was actively healing itself, swallowing any evidence of their passage. Jens stared, his face grim. It knows where we are. It's toying with us. The feeling of being watched, of being herded, intensified. Eris couldn't shake the sensation that Niflheim's tooth was not just a passive landmark, but an eye, following their desperate flight. They pressed on. The terrain grew more treacherous as they neared the coordinates Finch had marked for the Kestrel camp. They were forced to navigate a field of shattered ice, a chaotic jumble of sharp-edged blocks and hidden drops, the glacier's outwash plain. It was here that the entity played a crueler trick. Eris was picking his way across a relatively stable-looking snow bridge when the ice beneath his feet suddenly seemed to shimmer and dissolve. For a heart-stopping moment, he was looking down not into a shallow depression, but into a vast, glowing chasm, its depths filled with the same crystalline structures he'd seen in his visions, pulsing with a cold, internal light. He heard the chorus of whispers swell from below, beckoning, promising knowledge, promising an end to the cold and fear. He cried out, stumbling back, scrabbling for purchase. Jens, reacting instantly, grabbed his arm, hauling him away from the precipice. Eris. Snap out of it. There's nothing there. Eris blinked, his vision clearing. He was standing on solid, if uneven, ice. The chasm was gone. Before him was just a small, shallow crevasse, easily stepped over. But the memory of that terrifying, alluring void was seared into his mind. It tried to lure me in, he gasped, his body trembling. Jens's face was pale. We need to keep moving. We can't let it get into our heads like that. But it was already in their heads. The constant psychological pressure, the physical exhaustion, the gnawing fear, it was all taking its toll. They bickered over the best route, their tempers flaring with a desperate irritability. Doubt gnawed at them. Was the Kestrel camp even still there after all these decades? Were they walking into a trap? As the dim light began to fade into the deeper gloom of the polar afternoon, they saw it. Or rather, what was left of it. Against a backdrop of towering ice cliffs, half buried in snow, were the tattered remains of heavy canvas tents, their poles snapped and leaning at crazy angles. And nearby, almost completely swallowed by a massive snowdrift, was the dark shape of a prefabricated hut, its roof caved in on one side. The Kestrel camp. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Eris, relief at having found it, dread at what it might contain, and a profound, weary sadness for the men who had perished here. They approached cautiously, Jens with a salvaged ice axe held ready, Eris scanning their surroundings. The silence here was different from the silence around Hyperion. It was older, deeper, weighted with tragedy. The hum of Niflheim's tooth was still present, but fainter, more distant. The canvas tents were shredded, offering little more than frozen tatters. But the hut, despite the collapsed roof section, looked potentially defensible. With considerable effort, they managed to clear the snow from the entrance and force open the frozen door. Inside, it was dark, frigid, and filled with the ghostly detritus of a lost expedition. Overturned bunks, scattered scientific equipment coated in frost, a rusted stove, and everywhere, the pervasive sense of sudden, desperate abandonment. And something else. As their flashlight beams cut through the gloom, they illuminated a series of strange, intricate symbols scrawled on the wooden walls, drawn in what looked like a mixture of soot and, something darker, rust-colored. They were geometric, spidery, unlike any human script Eris had ever seen. Some resembled the crystalline structures from his visions. What in God's name is that? Jens whispered, his flashlight beam trembling on the disturbing glyphs. Eris felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He recognized the style. Some of the more complex symbols were disturbingly similar to the patterns he'd fleetingly seen glowing within the gray stone he still carried in his pack. Finch hadn't mentioned these symbols in his journal. Had they been drawn in the expedition's final, maddened days? Or had something else been here? Then, from the far corner of the hut, from beneath a pile of collapsed timbers and frozen canvas, came a sound. A faint, scratching, rustling sound. Jens raised his ice axe. Something's in here. Slowly, cautiously, they approached the corner, their flashlight beams converging on the pile of debris. The scratching stopped. Then, a low, guttural growl, unlike any animal either of them had ever heard, echoed in the confines of the ruined hut. They were not alone in the Kestrel camp, Chapter 11, The Scrawlings and the Shadow. The guttural growl sent a fresh wave of adrenaline coursing through Eris and Jens. They froze, their flashlight beams fixed on the pile of debris in the corner, muscles tensed, ready for, they didn't know what. Jens, Eris whispered, his voice barely audible above the thumping of his own heart, what kind of animal out here makes a sound like that? Arctic foxes yelped. Polar bears huffed and roared, but this was something different, something deeper, more deliberate. None I've ever heard, Jens muttered back, his knuckles white where he gripped the ice axe. And none that should be holding up in a derelict hut. The rustling started again, accompanied by another low growl, this one carrying a distinct note of agitation. Slowly, a section of the frozen canvas shifted, and something dark and sinuous snaked out from beneath the debris. It wasn't an animal limb. It looked more like a thick, leathery tendril, black as pitch, glistening faintly in their flashlight beams. It probed the air for a moment, then retracted. Eris felt a primal revulsion, a deep, instinctual wrongness. This was no natural creature of the Arctic. Back up, Jens hissed, pulling Eris slowly towards the hut's entrance. Slowly. Don't make any sudden moves. They retreated step by cautious step, their eyes never leaving the corner. The growling intensified, and the debris pile began to shift more violently. More tendrils, thinner and whip-like, emerged, lashing out blindly. Then, with a sudden heave, a section of the collapsed timbers was thrust aside, and it began to emerge. It was not large, perhaps the size of a wolf, but its form was a nightmare. Its body was amorphous, a shifting mass of oily blackness, from which sprouted numerous tendrils of varying thickness. There were no discernible eyes, no mouth in the conventional sense, but Eris had the horrifying impression of a malevolent, focused intelligence. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, its form constantly rippling and reforming, as if the normal laws of anatomy didn't apply to it. And embedded in its dark flesh, like grotesque jewels, were shards of what looked like ice, or perhaps crystal, that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, the same light he'd seen in the depths of the chasm illusion. What is that? Eris breathed, a mixture of terror and horrified fascination gripping him. Don't care, Jens grunted, shoving Eris towards the door. Out! Now! As they scrambled backwards, the creature lunged, or rather, flowed, towards them with surprising speed. One of its thicker tendrils lashed out, narrowly missing Jens's leg, striking the wooden doorframe with a sickening thud, leaving a dark, steaming slime where it impacted. They burst out of the hut into the biting wind and fading light, stumbling in the snow. Jens slammed the rickety door shut, fumbling with the frozen latch, finally managing to secure it. They could hear the creature scrabbling and thudding against the inside of the door, its enraged growls muffled but still terrifying. We can't stay here. Eris yelled, his voice hoarse with panic. That thing, it's not from Earth. Jens leaned against the hut wall, panting, his face ashen. No kidding, document looked like something crawled out of a Lovecraft story. He gestured with his ice axe towards the door. Think that flimsy thing will hold it? The thudding from inside intensified, the door groaning under the impacts. We need to find somewhere else to shelter, or we deal with it, Eris said, though the thought of confronting that monstrosity armed with nothing but an ice axe and a few scientific instruments was ludicrous. Their immediate problem, however, was the encroaching darkness and the dropping temperature. They couldn't survive the night out in the open. The hut, despite its horrific new occupant, was their only viable shelter from the elements. Maybe it's trapped in that corner, Eris suggested, his mind racing. The debris, it seemed to be emerging from under it. And maybe it can squeeze through any crack, Jens countered. Looked pretty, fluid. They circled the small hut cautiously, peering through a grimy, cracked window on the side opposite the door. The interior was mostly shadow, but they could see the dark mass of the creature moving restlessly near the far wall, still growling and occasionally lashing out. It was then, with the dim, ambient light filtering through the window, that Eris got a clearer look at the strange symbols scrawled on the walls. He recognized them now, with a chilling certainty. They weren't just random scrawls. They were a crude, desperate attempt to replicate the complex, geometric patterns he'd seen within the gray stone, the patterns that seemed to be a hallmark of the entity from Nibelheim's tooth. Jens, he said, his voice low and urgent, look at these symbols. Finch didn't draw these. Or if he did, he was influenced. What are you talking about? They're like a language, a visual representation of the entity's consciousness, or its energy. Eris pulled the gray stone from his pack. Even in the dim light, he could see the faint, internal luminescence, the intricate, shifting patterns within. This stone, it's connected. These symbols on the wall. I think they're either a ward, an attempt to repel something, or a beacon, an attempt to summon or bind something. The creature inside the hut let out a particularly furious roar, followed by a series of heavy thuds against the wall near the window, making them jump back. Well, if it's a ward, it ain't working too well, Jens grumbled. And if it's a beacon, I don't like what it summoned. An idea, desperate and terrifying, began to form in Eris's mind. Finch's journal, he mentioned Armitage barricading himself in the radio hut, trying to send a warning. What if Armitage wasn't just trying to warn the outside world? What if he was trying to fight back, using what he'd learned about the entity? He remembered the equations his own voice had recited during his lost time, equations he hadn't understood. What if Armitage, the physicist, had figured out something about the entity's resonant frequencies, its vulnerabilities? The creature, Eris said, thinking aloud, it has those crystalline shards embedded in it. Like the structures I saw in my visions, like the patterns in this stone. What if those are its connection point to the main entity, or its power source? And you're planning to do what, Doc? Ask it nicely to give them up. No, Eris said, his gaze fixed on the gray stone in his hand. What if we could disrupt its connection? Create a counter-resonance. Finch's men were driven mad, absorbed. But this creature, it's a physical manifestation. Maybe it's more vulnerable. It was a wild leap of logic, based on fragmented visions, unsettling coincidences, and the desperate writings of a man descending into madness. But it was something. We need to get back into that hut, Eris said, a cold resolve settling over him. We need to see if there's anything left of Armitage's work. Any notes, any equipment. And we need to deal with that thing. Jens stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Which, Eris reflected, was a distinct possibility. You want to go back in there? With that squid dog from hell? We don't have a choice, Jens, Eris said, his voice quiet but firm. We either fight it here, on our terms, or we wait for it to break out and hunt us down in the open. Or we freeze to death. This camp, these symbols, that creature, they're all connected to what's happening at Nibelheim's tooth. This is where we make our stand, or where we die trying to understand. The wind howled around them, carrying the distant, mournful groan of the great glacier. Inside the hut, the creature growled, a promise of violence and alien horror. Eris clutched the cold, faintly glowing stone, his mind racing, trying to piece together a desperate plan from the fragments of a nightmare. Chapter 12, The Resonance of Despair. The decision to re-enter the hut, now that they knew what lurked within, felt like signing their own death warrant. Yet, as Eris had said, the alternatives were no less grim. The polar night was closing in, the temperature plummeting, and the howls of the wind seemed to carry the mocking laughter of the entity from Nibelheim's tooth. "All right, Doc," Jens said, his voice tight with a reluctant resolve, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "If we're doing this, we do it smart. Or as smart as two scared witless men can be in this frozen hell." Their arsenal was pitiful. Jens had his ice axe. Eris had a heavy geological hammer and the strange grey stone, which felt almost warm in his pocket now, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic energy. They also had a single flare pistol with 2 remaining flares, hardly ideal for combat, but perhaps useful for distraction or illumination. "The creature reacted to the light when we first opened the door," Eris mused, his mind racing. "Maybe it's photosensitive, or at least disoriented by sudden brightness." "Worth a try," Jens conceded. "So, what's the plan? You distract it with your pet rock while I try to play piñata with its head?" Eris ignored the sarcasm. "The symbols on the wall. Armitage's potential work, if there are any notes, any diagrams, they're likely near where he would have worked, probably near the remnants of their radio equipment, if any survived." He remembered Finch's last entries mentioning Armitage barricading himself in the radio hut. Perhaps this main hut had served as both. "We need to create a diversion, get inside, and I need to search that area. You try to keep it occupied, or at least away from me." It was a flimsy plan, bordering on suicidal, and they both knew it. "Keep it occupied," Jens repeated, shaking his head. "Right. Easy peasy." He checked the heft of his ice axe. 1 flare to get in. If we find anything useful, great. If not, we grab what supplies we can from the other side of the hut and get the hell out, try to reinforce the door better, and pray it doesn't tear its way out before morning. They approached the hut's main door, the sounds of the creature's agitated movements and guttural growls clearly audible from within. Eris took a deep breath, trying to quell the tremor in his hands. He focused on the grey stone in his pocket, on the faint, rhythmic pulse he could feel through the fabric of his glove. He tried to recall the complex, geometric patterns he'd seen within it, the crystalline structures from his visions, the equations his own voice had recited. He didn't understand them, not truly, but he had a desperate, intuitive feeling that they were the key. Resonance. Counter-resonance. The words echoed in his mind. "Ready?" Jens whispered, his eyes fixed on the door. Eris nodded, pulling out the flare pistol. He loaded a flare. "On 3. I fire the flare through that crack near the top of the door. The moment it ignites, you unlatch and push. I'll be right behind you." "Here's hoping it doesn't like fireworks," Jens muttered. 1, 2, 3. Eris jammed the muzzle of the flare pistol into the crack and fired. The flare ignited with a blinding flash of crimson light and a loud hiss, momentarily illuminating the interior of the hut through the gaps in the door. Simultaneously, Jens threw his weight against the door, unlatching it. The door burst inward. For a split second, the hut was bathed in the intense, flickering crimson glow of the flare. The amorphous black creature was there, larger than they remembered, recoiling from the sudden light and noise, its numerous tendrils flailing, its embedded crystalline shards pulsing erratically. It let out a high-pitched shriek, a sound that scraped Eris's nerves raw. "Now!" Jens yelled, charging in, ice axe raised. Eris followed, his geological hammer in hand, his eyes scanning frantically for any sign of Armitage's work amidst the debris. The flare, still burning fiercely, cast dancing, demonic shadows. The creature, momentarily disoriented, recovered quickly. It lunged not at Jens, but at the still-burning flare, one of its thick pseudopods slapping it across the room where it sputtered against a pile of frozen canvas. The hut was plunged back into near darkness, relieved only by the weak beams of their headlamps. "Jens! Watch out!" Eris cried. The creature turned its attention to Jens, flowing across the floor with terrifying speed. Jens met its charge, swinging his ice axe in a wide arc. The sharpened pick connected with one of the creature's tendrils, eliciting another ear-splitting shriek. Dark, viscous fluid, almost black, sprayed from the wound, and the severed portion of the tendril writhed on the floor like a dying snake. But the creature was undeterred. More tendrils shot out, trying to entangle Jens, who danced back, parrying and striking, his movements surprisingly agile for a man his size. Eris, meanwhile, scrambled towards the corner where he guessed the radio equipment might have been, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He found a smashed table, overturned chairs, and a tangle of wires leading to a battered metal box that might have been a power unit. And then he saw it, a leather satchel, half buried under a collapsed shelf, similar to the one that had contained Finch's journal. He fell to his knees, tearing at the frozen buckles, his fingers numb with cold and adrenaline. The creature shrieked again as Jens landed another blow. "Doc! Whatever you're gonna do it fast." Jens yelled, his voice strained. He was being forced back, the creature pressing its attack relentlessly. The satchel finally came open. Inside, a few scientific instruments, broken and corroded. And beneath them, a slim, leather-bound notebook, Armitage's. Eris flipped it open, his eyes devouring the pages. Much of it was complex physics equations, calculations regarding wave propagation, resonant frequencies, and quantum entanglement, far beyond Eris's expertise. But then he found diagrams, crude sketches of crystalline structures, similar to the patterns on the walls and in the stone. And notes, scrawled in a desperate, spidery hand. The listener resonates, a matrix of specific frequencies, vulnerable to harmonic disruption, counter-signal, requires precise calibration. The crystals, they are the key, conduits, or anchors. And then, a single, chilling sentence, it learns from our minds, adapts, the patterns must be dynamic, evolving. Eris's blood ran cold. Evolving. This wasn't a static problem with a single solution. Jens cried out in pain. Eris looked up. One of the creature's tendrils had wrapped around Jens's leg, pulling him off balance. The creature lunged, its amorphous body flowing towards the fallen man. There was no time. Eris didn't understand the equations, but he understood resonance, disruption. He pulled the gray stone from his pocket. It was vibrating intensely now, almost painfully hot against his palm, the internal light pulsing in sync with the terrified rhythm of his own heart. He focused all his will, all his desperate, scientific curiosity, all his fear and rage, into the stone. He pictured the crystalline structures, the discordant frequencies, the concept of a signal that would shatter, not resonate. He didn't know how to do it, but he poured his intent into the stone, projecting the most chaotic, disruptive mental static he could muster, amplified by the stone's own strange energy. He screamed, a raw, primal sound, and thrust the stone forward, towards the creature, towards the pulsing green crystals embedded in its shifting black flesh. For a moment, nothing happened. The creature, poised over Jens, seemed to hesitate. The green light in its crystals flickered. Then, the stone in Eris's hand blazed with an intense, white light, so bright it seared his vision even through closed eyelids. A high-pitched whine, excruciatingly loud, filled the hut, climbing in frequency beyond the range of human hearing, but Eris felt it in his teeth, his bones, a vibration that threatened to tear him apart. The creature shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and recoiled from Jens as if struck by an invisible hammer. The green crystals in its body flared violently, then began to crack, to shatter, emitting puffs of black, acrid smoke. Its amorphous form convulsed, tendrils thrashing wildly, then it began to dissolve. Not into liquid, but into a dissipating cloud of oily black particles, like superheated ash, that swirled in the air for a moment before vanishing. The high-pitched whine cut off abruptly. The blinding white light from the stone faded, leaving spots dancing before Eris's eyes. Silence descended, broken only by Jens's ragged gasps and Eris's own labored breathing. The creature was gone. Where it had been, only a dark, greasy stain on the floorboards and a few lingering shards of dull, lifeless crystal remained. Eris swayed on his feet, the gray stone falling from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the floor. It was dull now, cold to the touch, its internal light extinguished. He felt utterly drained, as if his very life force had been poured into that desperate act. Jens pushed himself up, clutching his leg where the tendril had gripped him. His face was pale, beaded with sweat, but he was alive. He stared at the spot where the creature had been, then at Eris, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, horrified respect. Chapter 13, The Price of a Pyrrhic Victory. The silence in the Kestrel hut, after the violent psychic and physical assault, was profound, broken only by the ragged breathing of the two men and the incessant, mournful howl of the Arctic wind outside. Eris felt hollowed out, every nerve ending frayed, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, relief, terror, and a dawning, terrifying understanding of what he had just done. Jens, wincing, examined his leg. The creature's tendril had left deep, bruising welts, and the fabric of his thermal trousers was torn and stained with the dark, viscous fluid the creature had bled. Nasty grip, he muttered, probing the injury. Doesn't seem to be broken, though. Burns like hell. Eris pushed himself unsteadily to his feet, his gaze drawn to the dull gray stone lying on the floor. He picked it up. It was inert, cold, no different from any other rock he might find on a barren shore. Yet, moments ago, it had blazed with impossible light and unleashed a force that had disintegrated a creature of nightmare. "Are you all right?" he asked Jens, his voice hoarse. Jens nodded, testing his weight on his injured leg. "I'll live. Thanks to you, document whatever that light show was." He looked at Eris, a new, wary respect in his eyes. "You didn't mention you could do that." "I didn't know I could," Eris admitted, turning the cold stone over in his fingers. "It was an instinct. A desperate guess based on Armitage's notes, on what I've been experiencing." He gestured towards the scattered pages of Armitage's journal. He wrote about harmonic disruption, about the crystals being conduits. I think I just overloaded it, using the stone as a focus, a resonator." "Resonator for what?" "Your bad mood." Eris managed a weak, shaky smile. "Something like that. My mental static. My fear. I just pushed it all out, through the stone." He looked at the spot where the creature had dissolved, a faint, greasy patch already beginning to freeze on the floorboards. "It worked. But I don't know if I can do it again. Or what the cost was." He felt utterly depleted, his mind aching, his energy reserves drained to zero. They spent the next hour making the hut marginally habitable. Jens, despite his injury, managed to barricade the door more securely with salvaged timbers and rope. Eris, moving like an old man, gathered what remained of Armitage's notes and any potentially useful supplies from the Kestrel team's meager leavings, a few tins of preserved meat, some rock-hard biscuits, a half-full canister of fuel for their small stove. The Kestrel team's sleeping bags were frozen solid and mostly rotted. But they found some relatively intact woolen blankets. As Eris sorted through Armitage's journal, a chilling realization struck him. The physicist hadn't just been trying to understand the listener, he'd been trying to weaponize its own principles against it. The complex equations, the diagrams of crystalline lattices, it was a desperate attempt to create a technology, or perhaps a mental discipline, to fight an enemy that operated on a psychic, resonant level. The patterns must be dynamic, evolving, Armitage's last coherent words. The creature they'd fought, had it been an adaptation? A physical soldier sent by the listener, perhaps more resilient to Armitage's earlier attempts at disruption? And Eris's own improvised psychic blast, had he inadvertently given the listener new data, a new pattern to analyze, to adapt to? The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. He was an active participant in a terrifying, alien arms race he didn't understand. "We need to try the radio again," Eris said, his voice barely above a whisper. Armitage was trying to send a warning. Maybe he found a way to shield the signal, or a specific frequency the listener couldn't easily jam. They found the Kestrel team's radio equipment in the corner where Armitage had evidently made his last stand. It was a heavy, archaic-looking valve-based transmitter, battered and coated in frost. Miraculously, some of Armitage's modifications were still visible, strange, coiling antennae fashioned from copper wire, and what looked like a series of quartz crystals embedded around the main tuning coil. It took hours of painstaking work, fueled by dwindling rations and sheer desperation, for Jens, with Eris assisting, to coax the ancient radio back to some semblance of life. They cannibalized parts from their own damaged equipment, used the last of their stove fuel to thaw frozen components. Finally, a faint hum emanated from the speaker, and the needles on the antiquated dials flickered. Powering up, Jens muttered, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the valves. "Don't know if it'll transmit, or if anyone out there could even pick up this old piece of junk, but it's all we've got." Eris took the microphone, his hand trembling. He thought of Armitage, sitting in this very spot, frantically trying to warn an unheeding world. He took a deep breath. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he began, his voice low and urgent. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne, transmitting from the Kestrel Expedition Base Camp, Nibelheim region, Greenland. Station Hyperion has been compromised. We are under attack by an unknown hostile entity of non-human origin. This entity is psychic, capable of manipulating perception and reality. It is tied to anomalous activity within the Nibelheim's Tooth Glacier. Repeat, we are under attack. Request immediate assistance. This is not a drill." He repeated the message, over and over, varying the frequencies slightly based on some of Armitage's cryptic notes about clear channels. For a long time, there was only static. The oppressive silence of the Arctic, broken only by the howl of the wind and the faint hum of the radio. Eris felt a crushing despair settle over him. It was useless. They were truly alone. Then, through the hiss and crackle, a voice. Faint, distorted, barely audible. "Ipete, Asian. Is this Kilo? Sierra? Tango?" It was English, but heavily accented, the signal fading in and out. Eris and Jens stared at each other, hope warring with disbelief. "Kilo Sierra Tango?" Eris said. "KST. Kestrel." He grabbed the microphone. "Yes. This is Kestrel Base. We read you, faintly. Repeat, who is this?" The voice returned, slightly clearer this time, but still broken by static. "His is, Valbard, Ostgard, Iseving, Eek and, Rubled signal. You say. Kestrel Base. That, sign was lost, 57. Svalbard Coast Guard." Someone was hearing them. A tiny, fragile spark of hope ignited in Eris's chest. "Yes. Lost in 57. We are survivors, no, successors. There is an ongoing threat here. A hostile entity. Hostile, tidy. Please, Erifi. Your signal is, eerie unstable. Are you, danger?" Before Eris could reply. Before he could pour out the entirety of their horrifying story, the radio emitted a deafening screech of static, a sound so violent it made them recoil. The lights in the hut, powered by the Kestrel team's ancient generator which Jens had miraculously revived, flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The hum from the radio cut out. Jens swore, fumbling for his flashlight. What happened? Overload? Eris knew, with a sickening certainty, it wasn't an overload. The quality of the static, its sheer, malevolent intensity, it was the listener. It had found their signal. It had allowed them that brief moment of hope, only to snatch it away. He scrambled to the radio, his hands sweeping over the controls in the dark. It was dead. Completely dead. The faint smell of ozone and burnt insulation filled the air. "It knows," Eris whispered, his voice hoarse with despair. It let us make contact. It wanted to know who we were talking to. It's learning. Adapting. The fragile hope of rescue vanished, replaced by a chilling certainty. The listener wasn't just a localized phenomenon anymore. It was aware of the outside world, aware of potential interference. And it had just demonstrated its ability to reach out, to silence them, even through an ancient, jury-rigged radio. Jens finally got his flashlight working, its beam weak and flickering. He shone it on Eris's face. "So, what now, Doc?" "They heard us, for a moment. Maybe they'll send someone to investigate, eventually." "Eventually could be weeks, months," Eris said, his voice flat. "And by then, who knows what this place will be like?" "What will be like?" He looked at the dead radio, then at the dull gray stone he'd placed on the table. "It's playing with us, Jens. It's a cat, and we're the mice. And I think I just showed the cat a new way to hunt." The brief contact with the outside world had not brought salvation. It had brought the chilling realization that their prison was far larger, and their captor far more intelligent and malevolent, than they had ever dared to imagine. The Pyrrhic victory over the creature in the hut felt hollow indeed. Chapter 14, The Silent Retaliation. The dead radio was a monument to their crushed hope. In the flickering beam of Jens's flashlight, it looked like a derelict shrine to a forgotten god. The silence that followed its demise was heavier, more pregnant with menace, than any they had yet experienced in the Kestrel hut. "So," Jens said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual gruffness, "that's it, then. No cavalry coming over the hill." He slumped onto an overturned crate, the picture of weary defeat. "It heard us. It knows we tried to call out. What do you think it'll do?" Eris didn't have an answer, only a sickening premonition. The entity hadn't responded with an immediate, overt attack after they'd destroyed its physical manifestation. It had waited, observed, allowed them their brief, desperate attempt to contact the outside world. That suggested a terrifying patience, a cold, calculating intelligence. "It's learning," Eris said, his gaze sweeping the shadowy corners of the hut. "Each interaction, each attempt we make to understand or resist, it gathers more data. When I used the stone, when we used the radio, we gave it new information about ourselves, about our capabilities, about the world beyond its ice." He thought of Armitage's chilling insight, "It learns from our minds, adapts, the patterns must be dynamic, evolving. So, it's not just going to send another one of those squid dogs?" Jens asked, a sliver of his old sarcasm returning, though it was brittle now. "I don't think so," Eris replied slowly. That was direct. Crude, almost. "My guess is its next move will be more subtle. More psychological. It knows our fears now. It knows what we value." He thought of the illusion of Sarah, of Jens hearing his deceased wife. He thought of his own desperate cry for help, invoking the name of his past failure, Code Polaris. The entity had already used that against him. They spent the rest of the dim polar day in a state of heightened, anxious vigilance. Every creak of the hut, every shift in the wind, sent their hearts leaping. They ate their meager rations in silence, the preserved meat tasting like ash in their mouths. As the deeper gloom of the long Arctic night settled, the temperature inside the hut, despite their small, sputtering stove, dropped significantly. The entity's retaliation, when it came, was not with a roar, but with a whisper. It began with the cold. Not just the ambient, physical cold of their environment, but a profound, bone-deep chill that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the hut, from the ice-encrusted ground beneath their feet. It was a cold that leached warmth, sapped energy, and brought with it a creeping despair. Then came the sounds. Not the overt tapping or the fabricated voices, but something far more insidious. Faint, familiar sounds from their pasts, woven into the whistle of the wind, the crackle of the stove. Eris would hear the distant laughter of his daughter, Lily, as if she were playing just outside the hut. Jens would flinch, swearing he heard the jingle of his wife's keys, or the specific way she used to hum while cooking. These sounds were fleeting, always on the edge of perception, designed to fray their nerves, to make them doubt their own senses, to keep them perpetually on edge. The visual distortions also returned, more subtly. Shadows in the corners of the hut would seem to lengthen and coalesce into vaguely human shapes for a fraction of a second. The scrawled symbols on the walls would appear to shimmer, to writhe, as if alive. Eris even caught himself, on more than one occasion, seeing the faint, ghostly outline of the creature they had destroyed, superimposed over the spot where it had died, a fleeting afterimage of horror. But the most insidious attack was on their minds. Eris found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. His thoughts would scatter, his carefully constructed scientific reasoning dissolving into a miasma of fear and paranoia. He would try to analyze Armitage's notes, but the equations would swim before his eyes, the words losing their meaning, replaced by intrusive, alien concepts, the cold, geometric thoughts of the listener. He began to experience vivid, waking daydreams, more potent than before. He would be staring at the stove, and suddenly he was back in his university lab, years before the Polaris event, his colleagues congratulating him on a breakthrough, his future bright and promising. The illusion would be so complete, so sensually rich, that the return to the grim reality of the Kestrel hut was a physical shock, leaving him disoriented and filled with a profound, aching loss. Jens, too, was suffering. He became withdrawn, prone to long silences, his eyes holding a haunted, distant look. He would often stare at the spot where the creature had been, or at the door, as if expecting some new horror to burst through. He spoke less and less, and when he did, his words were often disjointed, tinged with a growing paranoia. He started hoarding small, useless items, a bent nail, a piece of string, a shard of broken glass, clutching them as if they were precious talismans. The gray stone, which Eris now kept constantly in his pocket, remained inert. He tried, several times, to replicate the burst of energy he'd unleashed against the creature, focusing his will, his fear, trying to tap into that disruptive resonance. But nothing happened. The stone remained cold, unresponsive. Had it been a one-time discharge? Or did it require a specific emotional or mental state, a perfect storm of desperation, that he couldn't consciously replicate? Or worse, had the listener already adapted to that specific weapon? One particularly bleak morning, though the perpetual twilight made the term meaningless, Eris woke from a fitful, dream-haunted sleep to find Jens gone. Panic seized him. He scrambled out of his makeshift bed of blankets, his heart pounding. Jens! Jens! The hut was empty, save for himself. The door was slightly ajar, a fine dusting of snow already accumulating on the threshold. Eris grabbed his geological hammer and rushed outside. The wind was a razor, whipping snow into his face. He scanned the desolate landscape, his eyes straining in the dim light. He saw footprints leading away from the hut, heading not back towards Hyperion, but further out, towards the vast, featureless expanse of the ice sheet, in the general direction of Nibelheim's Tooth. Jens, he screamed into the wind, his voice swallowed by the immensity. He followed the tracks, his fear a cold knot in his stomach. The entity was playing its cruelest game yet, isolating them, preying on their weakening minds. He found Jens perhaps half a kilometer from the hut, standing motionless, staring out at the glacier. He was not wearing his outer parka, only his thin inner thermals, despite the lethal cold. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide, unfocused, fixed on some distant point Eris couldn't see. Jens! Eris grabbed his arm. It was like touching ice. Jens, what are you doing? You'll freeze to death. Jens turned his head slowly, his movements stiff, unnatural. He looked at Eris, but it was as if he didn't see him. A faint, beatific smile touched his lips. They're calling me, Eris, he whispered, his voice thin, reedy. So beautiful. The songs, from the ice. My wife, she's waiting for me there. In the light. Eris's blood ran cold. This was how it had taken Finch's men. luring them with visions, with promises, with the voices of their loved ones. Jens, that's not real. Eris shook him, desperately trying to break through the delusion. It's the entity. It's trying to trick you. Your wife isn't out there. Jens's smile widened, becoming unsettlingly serene. Oh, but she is. I can hear her. So clearly. She says, it's warm in the ice. No more cold. No more pain. He tried to pull his arm free, to walk towards the glacier. I have to go to her. The silent retaliation was complete. The entity hadn't needed to send another monster. It had turned Jens's own grief, his own love, into a weapon against him. And now, it was drawing him into its frozen embrace. What in the seven hells did you just do, Doc? Eris could only shake his head, staring at the inert gray stone. He had no idea. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was far from over. They had won a battle, but the war against the listener, the mind in the ice, had only just begun. And he had a terrifying feeling that by using the stone, by tapping into that alien resonance, he had just made himself an even more interesting, and perhaps more dangerous, target. Chapter 15, The Siren Song of the Ice. Jens, no. Eris gripped Jens's arm tighter, his fingers digging into the thin thermal fabric, trying to anchor the man to the brutal, tangible reality of the wind and biting cold. Listen to me. It's a lie. A trick. But Jens was already lost, his gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering mirage of Nibelheim's Tooth. The glacier, in the dim, deceptive light, seemed to glow with an internal luminescence, its icy peaks appearing soft, inviting, like beckoning arms. The wind, to Eris, was a howling torment, but to Jens, it was clearly carrying the sweet, irresistible melody of the entity's siren song. She's so close, Jens murmured, a tear freezing on his pale cheek. I've missed her so much, Eris. So many years alone, he pulled against Eris's grip, his movements surprisingly strong despite his hypothermic state. Let me go. I need to be with her. Desperation clawed at Eris. He couldn't fight the entity's psychic assault with logic or reason when its tendrils were already so deeply embedded in Jens's grief-stricken mind. He needed something to shock him, to break the spell. He did the only thing he could think of. He drew back his fist and punched Jens hard on the jaw. The impact was jarring, sending a shockwave up Eris's arm. Jens staggered, his eyes losing some of their distant focus for a moment, a flicker of surprise, then pain, replacing the beatific smile. He raised a hand to his chin, looking at Eris with a dazed confusion. Wah! Eris? What did you? Snap out of it, Jens! Eris yelled, his voice raw with fear and frustration. Your wife is dead. She's not out there. That thing, that monster in the ice, it's using your memories, your love for her, to lure you to your death. Just like it did with Finch's men. The words, brutal and direct, seemed to penetrate the fog of Jens's delusion. The distant, serene look began to fade from his eyes, replaced by a dawning horror as the cold, harsh reality of their situation reasserted itself. He looked towards the glacier, then back at Eris, then at his own thinly clad arms, a shiver racking his body. My God, he stammered, his teeth chattering violently. I heard her. So clearly. She was calling me. He swayed, and Eris had to grab him to keep him from falling. The fight, the brief return to lucidity, had drained his last reserves of energy. I know, Jens. I know it felt real, Eris said, his voice softer now, but urgent. That's its power. We need to get you back to the hut. Now. You're freezing. Jens was barely able to walk. Eris half carried, half dragged him back towards the Kestrel camp, fighting against the wind, his own body screaming with exertion. The journey that had taken minutes seemed to stretch for an eternity. Jens was mumbling incoherently, his body limp, his skin frighteningly cold to the touch. Back inside the relative shelter of the hut, Eris stripped off Jens's thin thermals and wrapped him in every blanket they possessed, piling them on one of the dilapidated bunks. He stoked the small stove, adding precious pieces of salvaged wood, trying to raise the temperature in their frigid sanctuary. Jens was dangerously hypothermic, his breathing shallow, his pulse weak. Eris rubbed his limbs, trying to restore circulation, forcing sips of lukewarm, heavily sugared tea, one of the Kestrel team's last remaining luxuries, between his blue lips. For hours, Eris fought to bring Jens back from the brink. He talked to him, constantly, trying to keep him conscious, trying to anchor him to reality. He spoke of anything and everything, his research, the Polaris event, his daughter Lily, the mundane details of a world that now felt impossibly distant. He dared not leave Jens alone, terrified that the entity's insidious whispers would reclaim him if his own voice fell silent. Slowly, agonizingly, Jens began to respond. The shivering became less violent, his breathing deepened, and a flicker of awareness returned to his eyes. "Eris," he whispered, his voice a dry croak. "I'm here, Jens," Eris said, relief washing over him in a dizzying wave. "You're going to be okay." Jens looked around the grim confines of the hut, his gaze eventually settling on Eris's exhausted face. It almost had me," he said, a profound shame in his voice. "I was so sure it was her." "It knows how to get to us," Eris said grimly. "It uses what we love, what we fear." He didn't mention that he, too, had felt the pull, the seductive allure of the entity's illusions. As Jens slowly regained some strength, a heavy silence settled between them, filled with unspoken fears and the chilling realization of their extreme vulnerability. They had survived another attack, but they were weaker, more exposed. And the entity was undoubtedly aware of its failure to claim Jens. "What do we do now, Eris?" Jens asked finally, his voice still weak but lucid. "It's not going to stop. It'll try again. And next time one of us might not be strong enough to fight it." Eris looked at the dull gray stone on the table, then at Armitage's journal, its pages filled with desperate equations and mad insights. His brief, violent success against the creature felt like a distant memory, its power seemingly inaccessible now. Armitage was trying to find a way to disrupt it, Eris said, thinking aloud. A counter-resonance. But he said the patterns had to be dynamic, evolving. My outburst with the stone, it was a one-off. The listener has likely already adapted, analyzed that specific attack. He felt a crushing sense of futility. They were trapped in a feedback loop with an alien intelligence far beyond their comprehension, an intelligence that learned from their every move. There's one last thing, Eris said slowly, a desperate, half-formed idea beginning to take shape, born from a fragment of Armitage's notes he hadn't fully understood until now. Armitage had written about the crystalline conduits not just as vulnerabilities, but as potential amplifiers, if subjected to a specific, overwhelming resonant frequency. He'd hypothesized about a feedback cascade, a runaway overload. What is it? Jens asked, hope flickering faintly in his eyes. Eris looked towards the distant, brooding mass of Nibelheim's tooth, the heart of the entity's power. The Kestrel expedition, they were drilling ice cores. Armitage had his seismic thumper. He paused, the audacity of his thought making his breath catch. What if the main entity, the mind in the ice, has a physical core? A central crystalline structure, like the shards in that creature, but vastly larger. The nexus of its consciousness? Jens stared at him. And you're thinking. If we could reach it, Eris continued, his voice barely a whisper, if we could somehow deliver a massive, focused resonant shock directly to that core, maybe we could disrupt it catastrophically. Not just a localized effect, like with the creature, but a system-wide crash. It was an insane idea. Finding such a core, let alone reaching it through miles of treacherous ice, and then delivering a resonant shock, with what? Their bare hands. Their dwindling willpower. That's suicide, Eris, Jens said bluntly. Even if such a core exists, even if we could find it. Nibelheim's tooth is its stronghold. We'd be walking into the lion's den, a den that actively wants to eat our minds. Staying here is also suicide, Jens, Eris countered. A slower, more agonizing one. We're being picked apart, piece by piece. At least this is a chance, however remote, to fight back. To end it. He didn't voice his deeper fear, that the entity, with its rapidly evolving intelligence and its new awareness of the outside world, might not remain confined to Nibelheim's tooth forever. The thinning ice was its opportunity. What if it could spread, like a psychic virus, beyond the shores of Greenland? The thought was too horrifying to contemplate. We don't even know if the stone will work again, Jens argued, his voice laced with a desperate pragmatism. Eris picked up the cold, inert stone. Maybe it doesn't need to be this stone. Armitage wrote about resonant frequencies, about focused intent. The stone was a catalyst, a focus. Maybe the true weapon is our own minds, if we can learn to control the resonance, to project it. He looked at Jens, a wild, desperate light in his eyes. He said the patterns must be dynamic. What if it's not about a single attack, but about creating a sustained, overwhelming psychic dissonance? Jens stared at him, seeing not a rational scientist, but a man pushed to the very edge of sanity, grasping at straws in a sea of cosmic horror. Yet, what other choice did they have? Wait for the ice to sing them into oblivion? So, you're proposing we go on a suicide mission to the heart of a psychic ice god, armed with positive thinking and a rock? Jens asked, a bleak humor touching his lips. Something like that, Eris admitted. It's either that, or we become the next voices under the ice. The wind howled outside the kestrel hut, a lament for the damned. In the heart of the Greenland ice sheet, the listener waited, patient, ancient, and hungry. And two desperate men, stripped of everything but their fear and a sliver of defiant will, were contemplating a final, impossible gamble. Chapter 16, A Pilgrimage to the Abyss. The decision, once made, settled over them with the grim finality of a death sentence. There was no elation, no surge of heroic purpose, only the cold, hard resolve of men with nothing left to lose. They would take the fight to the listener, to the heart of Nibelheim's tooth, or die in the attempt. The alternative, to be slowly unraveled by its psychic tendrils, to become another chorus in its frozen song, was unthinkable. Their preparations were stark and hurried, dictated by their dwindling supplies and failing strength. They had little food left, a few tins of Kestrel's ancient meat, a handful of rock-hard biscuits, and the last of their tea. Fuel for the small stove was almost gone. Their only weapons remained Jens's ice axe and Eris's geological hammer. And, of course, the inert grey stone, which Eris now carried with a strange sense of both dread and reluctant reliance. Eris spent hours poring over Armitage's journal, trying to decipher more of the physicist's desperate theories. The concept of a dynamic, evolving pattern of psychic dissonance was maddeningly vague. It wasn't a simple equation or a repeatable experiment. It hinted at a mental discipline, a sustained projection of focused, chaotic energy designed to overwhelm the listener's resonant matrix. Armitage had theorized that the entity's very strength, its ability to absorb and integrate consciousness, could also be its weakness if confronted with a signal it couldn't process, a signal that was pure, weaponized noise on a psychic level. He was trying to teach himself to scream with his mind, Eris murmured to Jens, as they huddled by the dying stove, the last of their fuel burning low. A scream so loud, so discordant, it would shatter the listener's coherence. Jens, still weak but recovering from his brush with the entity's lure, just grunted. Sounds like a good way to shatter your own brain first. But he didn't argue. He, too, had felt the seductive pull of the ice, the terrifying intimacy of its intrusion. He understood, on a visceral level, that their only hope lay in an act of unimaginable audacity. They pored over Finch's hand-drawn map of Nibelheim's tooth, cross-referencing it with Eris's own more modern, though now unreliable, GPS data. Finch had marked several deep crevasses and potential subglacial access points near the glacier's core, places where the Kestrel team had hoped to drill. These were their targets, openings that might lead them closer to the hypothetical crystalline nexus of the listener. If such a core exists, Eris said, tracing a route on the map with a numb finger, it's likely deep within the oldest part of the glacier, where the ice is thickest, where its consciousness first took root. And where its influence will be strongest, Jens added grimly. We'll be walking into its very mind. They salvaged what little rope remained from the Kestrel camp, checked the sharpness of their tools, and divided their meager rations. Eris also packed Armitage's journal, hoping its cryptic insights might yet offer some guidance. He hesitated over the gray stone. It had been a conduit once. Could it be again? Or was it now just a memento of a fleeting victory, a dangerous focus for the listener's attention? In the end, he pocketed it. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was intrinsically linked to their fate. Before they left the dubious shelter of the Kestrel hut, Eris did one last thing. Using a charred piece of wood from the stove, he scrawled a message on the inside of the door, beneath the disturbing glyphs left by some unknown hand. Here fell the Kestrel. Here stand Thorn and Jensen. We go to face the listener. If we fail, know that it is real. It learns. It spreads. Warn them. It was a message for ghosts, or for some future, doomed expedition, but the act of writing it felt necessary, a final testament. They stepped out of the hut into the biting wind and perpetual twilight. The Greenland ice sheet stretched before them, a vast, silent, white labyrinth. Nibelheim's tooth loomed in the distance, its jagged peaks wreathed in mist, like the battlements of a malevolent fortress. The air thrummed with the faint, pervasive hum of its presence. Their journey was a descent into a frozen hell. The terrain was even more treacherous than before, the ice contorted into bizarre, unstable formations. Hidden crevasses lay in wait like hungry mouths beneath thin snow bridges. The cold was relentless, seeping into their bones, making every movement an agony. The listener did not ignore their pilgrimage. Its attacks were constant, insidious. The phantom whispers were louder now, more insistent, weaving through the howl of the wind. They saw fleeting apparitions in the swirling snow, figures from their past, monstrous shapes that flickered at the edge of vision, the ghostly Kestrel crew marching silently alongside them. Their own minds became battlegrounds. Eris fought against waves of crushing despair, against seductive illusions of rescue, of warmth, of safety. He would see Station Hyperion, miraculously repaired, its lights blazing a welcome, only to have it dissolve into the icy reality as he stumbled towards it. He would hear Lily's voice calling for him, pleading for him to come home, a torment that tore at his soul. Jens, though physically weaker, seemed to possess a renewed, if grim, mental fortitude after his near-fatal encounter with the entity's lure. He clung to the tangible, to the immediate task of survival. His focus narrowed to placing one frozen foot in front of the other, to probing the treacherous snow ahead. But even he was not immune. Eris saw him flinch from shadows, heard him mutter responses to unheard voices. They learned to distrust their senses, to rely on each other for confirmation of what was real and what was illusion. When Eris saw a phantom image, he would describe it to Jens, who would either confirm its unreality or, terrifyingly, sometimes admit to seeing something similar. They were two minds pitted against one, a meager defense against an entity that could reshape perception at will. The gray stone in Eris's pocket remained cold, inert. He tried, several times, to focus his will through it, to project that disruptive psychic static. But there was no response, no surge of power. Either the stone was depleted, or he lacked the precise mental trigger, or the listener had already found a way to dampen its effect. Days blurred into a hellish cycle of trudging, shivering, and fighting off the encroaching tendrils of madness. Their food dwindled. Their strength waned. They were shadows of their former selves, driven by a single, desperate purpose. As they drew closer to the main body of Nibelheim's tooth, the air grew heavier, the hum more intense. The very ice around them seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The glacier's face was a chaotic tapestry of sheer cliffs, towering seracs, and deep, shadowy chasms. They were entering the listener's sanctum. Finch's map led them to a vast, bowl-shaped depression at the foot of one of the glacier's main icefalls, an area Finch had marked as potential subglacial access, unstable. Here, the ice was fractured, rent by enormous crevasses, some so wide they could have swallowed a building whole. According to Finch, one of these leads down, deep, Eris said, his voice hoarse, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He consulted the brittle map, then looked at the treacherous landscape before them. He thought there might be a meltwater tunnel, or a geological fault line. They found it after hours of searching, a gaping black maw in the ice, partially hidden by an overhang of blue, ancient ice. It wasn't a clean-cut crevasse, but a jagged, irregular opening, descending into unimaginable darkness. A faint, cold draft emanated from its depths, carrying with it a stronger, more concentrated version of the listener's hum, and a chorus of faint, sibilant whispers. This was it. The entrance to the abyss. Jens looked at Eris, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a feverish light. So, document. After you. His attempt at bravado was thin, stretched taut over a core of profound terror. Eris nodded, his own fear a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He secured the end of their thin, precious rope around a sturdy ice bollard they managed to carve, then tied the other end around his waist. He had Armitage's journal tucked inside his parka, the geological hammer in his belt, the cold gray stone in his pocket. He looked back once at the desolate, white world they were leaving behind, then turned to face the darkness. If we don't make it back, Jens. We won't, Jens said, his voice flat. One way or another, this is a one-way trip. Let's just make sure we take the bastard with us. Eris took a deep breath, the frigid air searing his lungs. Then, with a silent prayer to whatever indifferent gods might be listening, he stepped over the edge and began his descent into the frozen heart of the listener. Chapter 17, Descent into the Crystalline Heart. The descent was a terrifying symphony of creaking ice, the scrape of their boots against the frozen walls, and the hollow thrum of their own anxious heartbeats. The darkness below the lip of the crevasse was not absolute, a faint, eerie luminescence, like trapped starlight, seemed to emanate from the depths, casting the ice around them in ghostly blues and greens. It was the same unnatural light Eris had seen in his visions, the light of the listener's crystalline core. Eris went first, Jens carefully paying out the rope from above, his silhouette a dark, reassuring presence against the dim sky. The ice walls of the crevasse were not smooth, but jagged and irregular, offering precarious handholds and footholds. Every shift of his weight, every crunch of his crampons, sent shivers of ancient ice cascading into the echoing darkness below. The air grew colder, heavier, saturated with the listener's pervasive hum. The whispers intensified, no longer just at the edge of hearing, but a constant, sibilant chorus that seemed to slither directly into his mind, bypassing his ears. They were a cacophony of voices, Finch's despair, Armitage's mad pronouncements, the ghostly cries of the kestrel crew, the seductive calls Jens had heard, and beneath it all, the cold, alien thoughts of the listener itself, a tapestry of ancient memories and insatiable curiosity. We feel you. Closer now. Warmth in the cold. Such interesting patterns. Eris fought to block them out, focusing on the rope, on his next handhold, on the rhythmic rasp of his own breathing. He recited scientific formulae, prime numbers, the names of geological epochs, anything to occupy his conscious mind, to create a barrier against the psychic intrusion. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 30 minutes, his feet touched a relatively solid surface. He was on a wide ledge, the crevasse continuing its descent into even deeper blackness below. Above, Jens was a small, distant figure. Jens! Eris yelled, his voice swallowed by the immense, echoing space. Ledge here. Relatively stable. Coming down after you. He braced himself, anchoring the rope, and Jens began his own careful descent. As Jens joined him on the ledge, they shone their headlamps around. They were in a vast, cathedral-like ice cavern. The walls soared upwards, lost in shadow, and downwards into impenetrable gloom. The air shimmered with the faint, internal luminescence of the ice, which was not clear, but shot through with strange, dark veins and embedded with what looked like massive, unrefined crystals, some as large as a man. Gods, Jens breathed, his voice filled with awe and terror. It's like the inside of a geode. This is its domain, Eris said, his gaze sweeping the cavern. Its heart. The hum was almost overpowering here, a physical vibration that resonated in their chests, making it difficult to think clearly. The whispers were a constant, seductive murmur, promising knowledge, peace, an end to suffering, if only they would yield, integrate, become one with the ice. From the ledge, a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, led deeper into the glacier, seemingly in the direction Finch's map had indicated as a potential meltwater tunnel. It glowed faintly from within with the same eerie luminescence. That way, I think, Eris said, pointing. According to Finch, this should lead towards the oldest ice, the core. They unroped, coiling the precious line. Their escape route, if such a thing even existed in their minds anymore, was now cut off. They were committed. The passage was claustrophobic, the ice walls pressing in on them, their surfaces slick and unnervingly warm to the touch in places, as if heated from within. Strange, organic-looking formations, like frozen fungi or grotesque, icy polyps, clung to the walls, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light that matched the hum. The psychic pressure intensified with every step. Eris felt his thoughts becoming sluggish, his memories blurring. He saw fleeting images of Sarah, of Lily, not as illusions this time, but as poignant, fading memories, as if the listener were trying to sift through his mind, to pluck out the most precious parts of him. He fought back, clinging to the image of Armitage's journal, to the desperate hope of a disruptive psychic scream. Jens, too, was struggling. Eris saw him stumble, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting nervously as if seeing things Eris could not. He would occasionally mutter, swatting at the air, as if warding off invisible tendrils. The passage opened into another, even larger cavern. This one was different. The air was noticeably warmer, almost humid, and the luminescence was brighter, emanating from a colossal, crystalline structure that dominated the center of the chamber. It was a breathtaking, terrifying sight. A geode the size of a cathedral, its interior lined with massive, perfectly formed crystals that pulsed with an intense, cold light, blues, greens, and violets. They soared upwards like the pipes of some monstrous organ, their facets reflecting and refracting the light into a million dazzling, disorienting patterns. At the heart of this crystalline formation, suspended as if by an unseen force, was a core of pure, black ice, so dark it seemed to swallow the light around it, yet from within it, Eris could sense an unimaginable concentration of consciousness, of ancient, alien thought. This was it. The nexus. The heart of the listener. The hum here was a deafening, soul-shattering roar, a symphony of cosmic power. The whispers were a tidal wave, threatening to overwhelm their sanity. You have come. To the source. To the stillness. To the knowing. Eris saw Jens falter, his eyes glazing over, a look of rapt, horrified awe on his face. He was succumbing, the sheer proximity to the entity's core too much for his mind to bear. Jens! Eris yelled, grabbing his arm, trying to shake him. Fight it. Don't listen. But Jens seemed to be in a trance, his gaze fixed on the pulsing black heart of the crystal formation. So much knowledge, he whispered. The universe, unfolding. I see everything. Eris knew he was losing him. He had to act, now. He pulled out the gray stone. It was vibrating violently in his hand, almost too hot to hold, its internal light blazing once more, a fierce white that seemed to push back against the colored luminescence of the cavern. He focused on the stone, on Armitage's desperate theories of psychic dissonance. He pictured the listener's vast, interconnected consciousness as a perfectly tuned crystalline lattice. His goal was not to resonate with it, but to shatter it with a chaotic, overwhelming, wrong signal. He dredged up every negative emotion he possessed, his fear, his rage at the entity's cruelty, his shame over the Polaris event, his grief for the Kestrel crew, his terror for Lily, for the world beyond this icy prison. He gathered it all, a raw, jagged ball of psychic agony, and tried to force it into the stone, to use the stone as an amplifier, a weapon. Scream! The wordless command from Armitage's journal echoed in his mind. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The scream was internal, a silent, focused blast of pure, weaponized despair, amplified and projected by the blazing white light of the stone, aimed directly at the pulsating black heart of the listener. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The cavern lights flickered, the colors shifting, becoming discordant, ugly. The deafening hum fractured, dissolving into a cacophony of shrieking, tearing sounds. The massive crystals around the core began to vibrate violently, cracks appearing on their perfect facets. The black heart of the listener seemed to convulse. The psychic whispers turned into a single, mind-shattering scream of unimaginable agony and outrage, a sound that was not a sound, but a wave of pure psychic torment that slammed into Eris, threatening to obliterate his consciousness. He staggered, blood trickling from his nose and ears, the stone searing his palm. But he held on, pouring every last ounce of his will, his pain, his defiance, into that silent, psychic assault. The crystalline structures around the core began to shatter, exploding outwards in showers of razor-sharp shards and blinding light. The black heart itself seemed to shrink, to implode, the light within it guttering like a dying star. Jens, jolted from his trance by the psychic backlash, cried out, shielding his eyes. The cavern was collapsing. Huge chunks of ice and crystal rained down from the roof. The ground beneath their feet buckled and split. Eris knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he had succeeded. He had struck a mortal blow. But the listener, in its death throes, was taking its prison, its sanctuary, its very heart, with it. And they were trapped inside, Chapter 18, the death throes of a god. The cavern was an apocalypse of sound and light. The psychic scream of the dying listener, though fading, still clawed at Eris's mind, a residue of unimaginable agony. The roar of collapsing ice, the shriek of rending crystal, and the deep, guttural groans of the glacier tearing itself apart filled the air. Shards of ice and crystal, some as large as boulders, rained down from the shattered roof, impacting with bone-jarring force. The brilliant, chaotic light from the exploding core pulsed erratically, casting the scene in strobing, nightmarish flashes. The ground beneath Eris and Jens buckled and split, wide fissures racing across the icy floor like black lightning. Eris! We have to get out of here! Jens yelled, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the cataclysm. He had managed to scramble to his feet, his face a mask of terror and disbelief, but his eyes were clear, the listener's thrall broken by the sheer violence of its demise. Eris, still reeling from the psychic backlash, his body aching, his senses overwhelmed, nodded dumbly. The gray stone in his hand was now just a rock, cold and heavy, its light extinguished. He had poured everything into it, into that final, desperate psychic assault. The passage, he managed to shout, pointing towards the narrow tunnel through which they had entered this crystalline hell. It was their only way out, assuming it hadn't already collapsed. They stumbled towards it, dodging falling debris, their headlamps casting wild, insufficient beams into the maelstrom. The air was thick with ice dust and the acrid, ozone-like smell of shattered crystal. The very fabric of reality in the cavern felt unstable, as if the listener's death had untethered it from the normal laws of physics. Eris saw fleeting, impossible geometries in the collapsing structures, glimpses of alien dimensions that seared his eyes. The entrance to the passage was partially blocked by a fallen crystal spire, but a narrow gap remained. Jens, despite his injured leg, threw himself at it, clawing his way through. Eris followed, squeezing through the tight space, jagged edges of ice tearing at his clothes. Inside the passage, the noise was slightly muffled, but the vibrations were terrifying, the ice walls groaning and cracking around them as if the entire glacier were collapsing in on itself. They scrambled onwards, driven by primal fear, their earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of immediate annihilation. The passage, which had seemed unnervingly warm on their way in, was now frigid, the strange, organic-looking polyps on the walls withered and dark, their light extinguished. The listener's life force was truly gone. They reached the ledge where they had left their rope, only to find it gone, severed by a falling ice shard, or perhaps deliberately cut by the collapsing crevasse walls. Their primary escape route to the surface was lost. Damn it! Jens swore, staring at the empty space where the rope had been anchored. Now what? Below them, the crevasse continued its descent into darkness. Above, the way they had come down was a treacherous, unstable chimney of fractured ice. "We have to go up," Eris said, his voice strained. "It's our only chance. Maybe the main crevasse is more stable further up." It was a desperate hope. Climbing out without a rope, on ice that was actively collapsing, was tantamount to suicide. But staying here was certain death. They began the ascent, Eris leading the way, testing each handhold, each foothold, with agonizing care. The ice was brittle, treacherous, chunks of it breaking away under his weight. Several times, he felt himself slipping, only to be saved by a desperate lunge for a new hold, his fingers raw and bleeding. Jens followed, his injured leg a severe impediment, his face contorted with pain and effort. But he didn't complain. The will to survive, raw and potent, burned in his eyes. Behind them, below them, the sounds of the glacier's death throes continued, deep, resonant booms as massive sections of ice collapsed, the high-pitched shriek of stressed crystal. The entire structure of Nibelheim's tooth felt like it was unraveling. The psychic silence was almost as unnerving as the previous chorus of whispers. The listener was truly gone. Its vast, ancient consciousness had been extinguished, or at least catastrophically disrupted. Eris felt a strange, hollow emptiness in his mind where its presence had been, a void that was both a relief and a source of profound unease. He had touched something ancient, something cosmic, and its absence was a tangible loss, despite its malevolence. After what felt like an eternity of grueling, terrifying ascent, fighting for every inch, Eris saw it, a faint glimmer of gray light far above. The surface. Hope, fragile and unexpected, surged through him. Jens. Light. I see the surface. Renewed by the promise of escape, they pushed themselves harder, their movements fueled by the last dregs of their adrenaline. The final section of the crevasse was a chaotic jumble of shattered ice blocks, a natural, albeit unstable, staircase. Eris was the first to haul himself over the lip of the crevasse, collapsing onto the snow-covered surface, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The air, though still bitingly cold, felt clean, fresh, blessedly free of the listener's oppressive psychic miasma. He turned to help Jens, reaching down, grabbing his outstretched hand, and pulling him up the last few feet. Jens collapsed beside him, his chest heaving, his face pale but alive. They lay there for several minutes, two broken men on a field of white, the only sounds their ragged breathing and the distant, fading rumbles from the depths of Nibelheim's tooth. The glacier, though still groaning, seemed to be settling, its death throes subsiding. Eris looked at the glacier. It appeared subtly different, its proud peak somehow diminished, its aura of malevolent intelligence gone, replaced by the inert grandeur of mere ice and rock. He had done it. He had faced the abyss, and he had, somehow, against all odds, triumphed. But the victory was Pyrrhic. They were stranded, hundreds of miles from civilization, with no supplies, no communication, and their bodies pushed to the very limit of endurance. The kestrel hut, their only shelter, was likely miles away, and reaching it would be another ordeal. Jens struggled to a sitting position, looking back at the gaping maw of the crevasse from which they had just emerged. "So, it's over?" he asked, his voice filled with a weary disbelief. The listener, it's really gone." Eris nodded slowly. "I think so. I felt it break. Its consciousness shattered. He clutched the cold, inert gray stone in his pocket. It had served its purpose. Or he had served its purpose. The distinction was disturbingly blurred. Then what was all that about the Svalbard Coast Guard? Jens asked, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. That voice on the radio, if the listener was just here. Eris frowned. That was a loose end, a detail that didn't quite fit. He had assumed the listener had faked the transmission, or allowed it through to gather information. But if the entity had been entirely localized within the glacier? Before he could ponder it further, a new sound reached them, cutting through the whine of the wind. A rhythmic, mechanical chopping sound, growing steadily louder. They looked at each other, then scanned the bruised twilight sky. There, approaching from the south, low against the horizon, was a helicopter. Not a figment, not an illusion. Its navigation lights blinked reassuringly in the gloom. Rescue. Impossibly, unbelievably, rescue. Jens stared, his mouth agape. I don't believe it. Eris felt a wave of dizziness, a lightness in his head that was more than just exhaustion. The Svalbard transmission, had it been real after all? Had their desperate mayday, broadcast on an ancient radio powered by sheer desperation, somehow, against all odds, been heard? The helicopter circled once, its searchlight sweeping across the desolate ice, then began to descend, its rotors whipping up a blizzard of snow. As it settled nearby, the side door slid open, and figures in heavy Arctic gear began to emerge. Eris and Jens could only watch, too stunned, too exhausted to move or speak. They had faced a cosmic horror, descended into the heart of an alien intelligence, and somehow, impossibly, survived. The world, it seemed, had not entirely forgotten them. Or perhaps, Eris thought with a sudden, chilling clarity, something else had guided their rescuers here. The universe was vast, and the listener, though defeated, was perhaps not the only ancient secret hidden beneath the ice. The price of their victory, and the true nature of their rescue, remained to be seen. Underscore 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 underscore.